It was different. Calm. Calm as a mountain that did not need to tremble to be feared. When he came down, with a confident step, the first thing he noticed was that Dumbledore was not an old man. His beard was shorter, his hair silver but still thick, his youthful face, though marked by magical time, radiated a solemn vitality. He was the same man he had imagined hundreds of times, but different. He was an archmage and Aurelian would know it even if no one had told him. "Good morning, Mr. Gaunt," Dumbledore said with a slight bow. "I am glad to finally meet you in person." "You are Dumbledore?" asked Aurelian, observing every detail of his figure. The voice, the body language, the eyes. He wasn't looking for an answer, but for a truth. "That's right. Headmaster of Hogwarts. Though I suppose you already know that," he said, giving him a smile. "Yes." Aurelian looked down for a second, thoughtfully, "but I didn't expect him to be so young." Dumbledore let out a soft laugh. "Age is a very relative matter in our world. One that, in time, you will learn to see with different eyes." They walked together down the corridor to the small inner garden. The conversation flowed without imposition. Dumbledore did not try to impress. Only to listen. "And you tell me they teach magic at Hogwarts?" asked Aurelian, with a hint of well-measured irony. "Not exactly. The magic already lives in you. We only help you to understand it, to control it, or not to be destroyed by it," I pointed out. "I've already learned a few things on my own," Aurelian replied without pride, but with conviction. "I imagine so. The castle chose you for a reason. But you still have much to discover." There was a moment of silence. Then Aurelian asked, as one who throws a stone into a pond, "Is it wrong, if I can talk to snakes?" Dumbledore's eyes flashed for an instant. Not with alarm. Nor with judgment. But with deep interest. "It's not wrong. It's odd. But weird isn't always dangerous. In fact, it's often necessary. I can understand them for as long as I can remember," Aurelian said, this time lower. "Sometimes I feel that they understand me better than people. Speaking in Parseltongue is a very ancient gift. Uncommon. We don't teach it at Hogwarts, because it can't be taught. But if that gift is in you, then it's part of your magic. And I won't be expelled for that, will I?" "Of course not." Dumbledore stopped in front of him. "Hogwarts does not fear what is different. It only fears what power can do without guidance." Their eyes met. A boy with the shadow of a dark lineage, and a man who had seen centuries of light and darkness. "Ready for your first visit to Diagon Alley?" Dumbledore's voice sounded kind, but with the veiled intention of watching the boy's reaction. Aurelian looked at him with the same expression he had rehearsed in front of the mirror for weeks, a slight, carefully created awe. "Diagon Alley? What's that?" he asked, arching an eyebrow with studied innocence. Dumbledore smiled. He didn't quite believe him, but he didn't question it either. "A place that, if you like magic, you'll end up loving," he replied. They caught the night bus on an empty corner of Kensington. After a couple of frantic jolts that made the windows squeak, they got off in front of a small, rickety pub wedged between two Muggle buildings, the Leaky Cauldron. Aurelian feigned surprise, though he had been there on previous visits, always with the help of Stinky's veil. This time, however, it was different. The place was brimming with visible and latent magic. A witch was drinking something steaming and changing color. In one corner, a wizard slept with an owl on his hat. Dumbledore greeted him with a nod to Tom, the innkeeper, who opened a back door for them that led to the small brick courtyard. There, with a graceful gesture of his wand, Dumbledore tapped the bricks with precision, 3 up, 2 to the center. The brick wall trembled, shrunk in on itself and opened like an ancient fan. Then, before Aurelian's eyes, Diagon Alley unfolded. Chapter 14, Chapter 14. Under the marble of the goblins' floating shelves, steaming cauldrons, hooting owls, robes billowing in the wind. Aurelian pretended to gape in amazement. Not out of pride, but out of strategy. It was not to appear that everything was familiar to him. This is amazing," he exclaimed, pointing to a broom store with amazed eyes. Dumbledore let out a soft, complicit laugh. "Yes, it is. Every time I come here, I find something new." They passed Flourish and Blots, where books fluttered between glass cases, beyond that an ingredient store that gave off the scent of mint and mandrake. Aurelian was observing everything with disguised attention. He was analyzing from the inside. Without arousing suspicion. Without showing his cards. "First, Gringotts," said Dumbledore, "it's where you'll get access to your resources for the official supply list." "Gringotts? Is it really run by goblins?" asked Aurelian in an incredulous tone. "With millennial efficiency," replied Dumbledore, though with a sense of humor, peculiar. They continued walking through the crowd. Wizards in absurdly colored robes, children with colorful frogs, witches with outlandish hairstyles. When they reached the marble steps of Gringotts, Aurelian stopped his pace and looked up. The white stone facade seemed more imposing in the magical light of the alley. At the entrance, 2 goblins watched them with shrewd eyes and perpetually furrowed brows. The gates of Gringotts were a warning in themselves. Cold, imposing, and silent as an ancestral judgment. Aurelian crossed them with a firm step, while at his side, Albus Dumbledore maintained the calm of someone who was well known in that place. The hall was as he remembered it, white marble, goblins at raised desks, the sharp sound of quills on parchment and magical coins clattering as they fell on enchanted scales. But this time, the air felt different. A few goblins looked up at the sight of the boy. Their eyes narrowed. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible murmur. They recognized him. Not by his face, but by his lineage. His magic. But none mentioned him. None interrupted. "Is it always this quiet?" asked Aurelian quietly, feigning a mixture of discomfort and astonishment. "It's part of the charm," replied Dumbledore with a gentle smile, "though I imagine the goblins prefer to call it efficiency." A black-robed goblin approached them. He wore an obsidian brooch in his lapel, a symbol of those in charge of special assignments. "Albus Dumbledore," he said with a minimal bow, "Headmaster of Hogwarts, it is an honor." Dumbledore spoke in a formal voice. "I am here to process the school allowance for young Aurelian Gaunt. He has been accepted into Hogwarts, and in accordance with the school fund for magical orphans, he is to be provided with a basic starting endowment." The goblin nodded, not taking his eyes off Aurelian. The latter responded with a neutral, polite look, but inside, he knew they were acting. They knew who he was. "Of course. The documentation has already been reviewed. If you would like to step into the waiting room, one of our administrators will be along shortly to assist the young man." Dumbledore turned to him. "I should be leaving, Aurelian. I have unfinished business at the ministry. I trust Gringotts will treat you well." "Thank you, Professor," the boy replied with a slight bow. "I'm excited to see what's underground." He smiled, satisfied, and took his leave with a slight wave of his robe. No sooner had Dumbledore stepped through the door than another goblin appeared with nimble steps. "Young Master Gaunt," he said with a restrained smile, warmer than usual among his kind, "we've been expecting you." Aurelian greeted him with a slight nod. "It is a pleasure to see you, Krivix. Let's get down to business." The two made their way to one of the private elevators, hidden behind a tapestry enchanted with faintly glowing runic symbols. "And Dumbledore?" asked Krivix in a low, somewhat sarcastic voice. "He still thinks I'm new to all this, I think." "Perfect," said the goblin, "that's as it should be, for now." As they descended towards the lower levels, Gringotts returned to its usual calm. The dark marble private room had a burnished oak table and a floating magical map that displayed, in dim light, various properties and assets associated with the name Aurelian Gaunt. Krivix settled behind a floating desk, and with a slight gesture of his long claw, activated a set of documents suspended in mid-air. Before Hogwarts consumes your time, we must define how you wish to handle your affairs, and leave everything in order. As you well know, not every 11-year-old wizard possesses such a solid portfolio. Aurelian sketched a slight smile. That's why I trust someone competent. Krivix nodded approvingly and began the report. As of today's date, your liquid assets amount to 737,890 galleons, a sum fueled by multiple sources. First, your Muggle investments have continued to grow. Nokia continues to rise. You also made substantial gains from your stake in Nimbus, especially after the anticipated launch of its new model. And the rest. A good part of the recent increase, Krivix continued, comes from several of your rural estates already producing basic magic ingredients. 2 of them have closed contracts with apothecaries and potion makers. The revenue stream, while still modest, is steady and promises to stabilize. Aurelian nodded with satisfaction. The elf held out a topaz sphere that projected a 3-dimensional map with dots marked in green, each blinking with a steady rhythm. In total you own 7 farm lots, all located in magically neutral areas. Several have discreet protection to keep out curious onlookers. And as for properties, the projection adjusted. You have, at this time, the following urban and magical properties. Gaunt Manor, restored and under strong magical protections. A small old building in Hogsmeade, still without definite use. An abandoned workshop in the Valley of Godric, acquired at low cost with projections of future value. And of course, the old Gaunt Cottage, in the woods near Little Hangleton. Currently uninhabitable, but still considered a point of magical heritage. The cabin, said Aurelian with a note of curiosity. I guess it's part of history. And as such, it should not be ignored, said Krivix. Some magical lines are more resilient than they appear, even if they have been sullied by history. What is the management plan while I am at Hogwarts? We will retain the current policy, staggered reinvestment, continued diversification, controlled use of funds. Land profits will be reinvested in infrastructure and more contracts. You just worry about learning, and growing. Aurelian held the goblin's gaze. Krivix closed the floating report with a precise gesture of his claw. The room returned to silence, interrupted only by the faint magical hum of goblin protections. Aurelian stared at the suspended map of the world he was building. He was 11 years old still, but his gaze was already that of someone who saw beyond adolescence and the classroom. During the school year, I don't need constant reports, Aurelian said, turning to the goblin. If something important happens, you can contact me by owl. But only if it's really necessary. I don't want unnecessary distractions. Krivix nodded, understanding immediately. Not all young wizards knew how to prioritize. What about the business you want to launch? It's time to start laying the groundwork, Aurelian replied calmly. Find and secure a location in Diagon Alley. Nothing extravagant, but with a good location and steady magical flow. Also. He paused briefly. Restore the property in Hogsmeade. Don't do it too quickly. Make it look like a smart investment, not like a shady maneuver. Also start the recovery of the workshop in Godric's Valley. I want it to be operational in the medium term. It could be useful for developing complex enchantments or more discrete tests. Krivix raised an eyebrow. Name of the project? Gaunt Corp, Aurelian replied, without hesitation. We'll start with Knock'em brooms, but there will be more. Potions. Custom enchantments. Real magical innovation, and eventually, research. But first I need a solid foundation. Then I'll act immediately. Discreetly. As always. They both stood up. As Aurelian turned to leave, Krivix stopped him by tossing him a small black leather pouch, perfectly closed with golden thread. The orphan funds Dumbledore is expecting, he said with a crooked smile. Take care of the image. Aurelian caught the bag on the fly and held it between his fingers. Thank you. Krivix watched him a second longer. In a low, almost prophetic voice, he murmured, You are amassing a fortune, young Gaunt. With every decision, with every seed we plant. The day will come, sooner than you think, when you won't be able to hide it. Nor will you want to. Aurelian did not respond. But his eyes shone with a mixture of determination and expectation. Bag in hand, he crossed the threshold of the private room on his way to meet Dumbledore again, aware that the most important thing in his life was just about to begin. The midday sun bathed the white marble of Gringotts, reflecting off the stairs with a warm glow. Aurelian descended with controlled pace, the bag of orphan funds securely in his hand, his thoughts still orbiting around Krivix, his investments and brooms that had yet to fly. When he fully exited the bank, a figure awaited him with surprising calmness. Albus Dumbledore, Archmagus, headmaster of Hogwarts and symbol of respect in the magical world, stood as if Diagon Alley were his private garden. He held a two-ball ice cream, perfectly balanced, with a slight sugary sheen under the sundae. Everything in order, he asked with a friendly smile, his tone casual as if he hadn't been shaping magical history from the shadows for years. Aurelian nodded, feigning a hint of nervousness. Yes, the bench is impressive. Dumbledore held out a second ice cream, caramel and mint flavored with chocolate shavings. One can't do school shopping without ice cream. It's an unwritten rule of the ministry, it should be. Aurelian accepted the gift with a small, sincere smile. Dumbledore, young in appearance but wise in every gesture, kept watching him with that all-catching, though not always revealing, gaze. So, Aurelian, is your satchel ready? Asked the headmaster with mischief in his voice. Ready, Professor, he replied, walking beside him. Shall we start with the robes or the wand? Wherever fate takes us first, and the ice cream doesn't melt. And so, amidst the murmurs of shoppers, the scent of new scrolls and ancient wands, the two disappeared among the stores of the alley, their shadows lengthening in the direction of the future. Chapter 15. Chapter 15. The echo of the election Diagon Alley vibrated with a life of its own. Excited voices, children's laughter, the clinking of galleons, the scent of magical ink and new leather filled the air. It was high season, prospective Hogwarts students were invading the stores with excitement and haste. Aurelian walked at a controlled pace, slightly behind Dumbledore, who strode forward with a carefree air, greeting shopkeepers and citizens with a serene smile and a nearly untouched ice cream in one hand. First things first, said Dumbledore without turning around. You'll need books and lots of them. They arrived in front of the grand facade of Flourish and Blots, where a stack of copies levitated in an enchanted dance next to a banner announcing, the best magic texts for bright young minds. Inside, the store was an orderly chaos, high shelves with titles sparkling, books muttering to each other, shoppers pushing magic carts. Aurelian calmly scrolled through the list of materials. Elemental Transformations by Emmerich Switch. 1,000 Magical Herbs and Fungi. History of Magic by Bathilda Bagshot. Advanced Magic Theory by Adalbert Waffling. Defense Against the Dark Arts, Introduction to the Shield. Guide to Basic Charms, Vol. I. Stars and Constellations, Astral Navigation in the Magical World. As the books piled magically into the floating basket, Dumbledore stopped beside a thick volume with an enchanted leather cover. He peered curiously, but without touching it. Avoid the ones that try to bite you, unless strictly necessary, he commented in an amused tone. Aurelian laughed softly, at the Archmage's mixture of solemnity and humor. Next came a visit to Obscurus Books, where they purchased some supplementary texts and moisture-resistant parchment, later to the small but well-stocked quill store The Silver Quill, where Aurelian chose 2 self-inking quills, one of faux phoenix feather and one of thestral, just in case. Next, they stopped at Madame Malkin, the magical robes store. Dumbledore sat in a purple velvet armchair while Aurelian stood on a dais surrounded by mirrors and floating wands that took measurements with mechanical precision. Do you like traditional black or do you prefer some more custom detailing? Asked the witch attending him. Black is fine, replied Aurelian, but, if it could have silver grey interior stitching, I'd like it. Subtle style. Good choice, said the witch with a complicit smile. After the last enchanted stitch and packing the new robes, they went out into the bustle of the alley once more. There are only two important things missing, commented Dumbledore, your wand, and cauldron. But I think the wand should go last. Wands always reserve the right to close the day. Aurelian nodded with an enigmatic smile. The dusty sign for Ollivanders, wand makers since 382 BC, hung crookedly over the small, narrow store between two more bustling businesses. The interior, however, was engulfed in reverent silence, barely interrupted by a soft magical hum, as if the thousands of wands stacked expectantly awaited the arrival of the next chosen one. Dumbledore held the door for Aurelian to enter first. One of the most important decisions of your life, he murmured, still smiling. Behind the counter, old Garrick Ollivander emerged between columns of stacked boxes, his trademark tousled white hair and silver eyes shining like mirrors. Ah! Mr. Gaunt, he said without preamble, his voice soft and almost hypnotic. Aurelian stopped dead in his tracks. Had he called him by his last name? He had given his full name only once at Gringotts, that piece of information wasn't officially recorded yet. No one in the alley was supposed to know. How did you? He started to speak, but stopped. Ollivander watched him with a faint smile that was neither entirely friendly nor entirely mysterious. An odd mixture of respect and caution. Wands whisper more than many realize, young sir. Some names leave seals, even unspoken, he replied, his gaze still fixed on him. Aurelian swallowed saliva. He felt a tingle of recognition, as if that store was speaking to him in a hidden language. He did not insist. He knew that Ollivander was not lying, that his way of understanding the world was closer to art than to logic. The ritual began. Ollivander offered him one after another, wands of willow, oak, spruce, fir, walnut, with cores of unicorn hair, phoenix feather, or dragon heart nerve. Some made sparks, others refused altogether. None seemed suitable. Until Ollivander stopped dead in his tracks. His fingers brushed over an older-looking, slightly dusty box. He stared at it for a few seconds before speaking, more to himself than to those present. Curious, I don't often offer this wand. He pulled a jet-black wand from the box, carved with an elegant yet organic design, like branches gently twisting in a spiral. It had a faint glow that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Its hilt was slender, almost skeletal, with curved lines that evoked stylized snakes. 30 centimeters exactly. Flexible. Horn snake horn core. Very powerful. A somewhat temperamental wand, but if it accepts you. Aurelian felt a strange shiver. He reached out his hand, and as he took it, the air changed. A wave of energy enveloped him, as if an invisible barrier had given way. The loose leaves floated for a few seconds, dust danced in the air, and the wand gave off a soft but deep flash. It was not explosive. It was intimate. As if he recognized it. Oh, yes, whispered Ollivander, fascinated. There it is. Very, very interesting. Dumbledore said nothing. His expression was thoughtful. Aurelian stared at the wand, feeling it part of his body. Not a tool, but an extension. What is the history of this wand? He asked in a low voice. Ollivander cocked his head to one side. As you must already sense, it has belonged to no one before. But it is, related to certain dark currents of ancient magic. Not dangerous in its own right, of course, but intense. If its bearer is not ready, it can consume rather than empower him. Aurelian nodded slowly. He accepted her. Not with fear, but with conviction. I'll take it. Ollivander smiled, more to himself than to them. Then let magic be your ally and not your chain. As they walked out, Aurelian felt the warmth of the wand still flowing down his arm. Then, silently, he thought, wands should not limit the wizard, but accompany him, propel him. They are not the beginning of magic, but they can be the channel where it becomes sublime. Inside him, something awoke. A certainty. Magic would not dominate him. He would elevate it. After leaving Ollivanders, Aurelian thought his tour of the alley was over. However, Dumbledore took a detour, leading him down a narrow side alley where a small store stood almost hidden, with a barely legible sign that read, "Enchanted locks and magical luggage." "One last stop," said the manager with a smile. Inside, the shop smelled of old leather and beeswax. Rows of trunks floated on high shelves, some emitting strange sounds from within, others with locks that sparkled softly. The owner, a squat warlock with a monocle and a gravelly voice, greeted them without much enthusiasm. Dumbledore chose a dark wooden trunk, with antique bronze fittings and a lock with runes engraved on it. After a few muttered incantations, he handed it to Aurelian. Magically expanded, with hidden compartments and protection from prying eyes, he explained, ideal for someone who will likely want to store more than just books. Aurelian touched the trunk and nodded. He didn't ask how much it cost. He knew it wasn't just any gift, but one with intent, a tool for his future. When they got outside, they walked a little further before Dumbledore stopped in front of a magical pet store. He looked at Aurelian with an affable expression. "Would you like a pet? A companion for Hogwarts, perhaps?" Aurelian hesitated. His mind filled with images, snakes in his dreams, the cold isolation of his training, the tasks he had yet to accomplish. A creature at his side would be a risk. Not for him, but for the world that still didn't understand him. "I appreciate the offer, Professor, but I'd rather not have one for now." Dumbledore did not insist. He only nodded slowly, as one who understood more than he appeared to. As they walked back towards the orphanage through the cobblestone streets of Diagon Alley, with the enchanted trunk loaded with magical supplies and his new wand resting in a protected compartment, Aurelian turned to Dumbledore with a measured, yet clearly hopeful expression. "Professor, considering that I already have everything I need and the alley is safe, would it be possible for me to stay here until the 1st of September? At the Leaky Cauldron, for example?" It was a reasonable proposal. There was no emotional urgency, no pleading. Just a well-articulated strategy. But Dumbledore, like him, was also a master at reading between the lines. The wizard stopped dead in his tracks, looking at him intently. His face, young and serene as in the golden days of his time in the International Confederation, needed no frown to convey tenderness. "A well-put suggestion, Aurelian, but the answer must be no," he replied calmly. "The Ministry keeps records, and although I am authorized to accompany you, you are still officially under the guardianship of the St. Emeric Orphanage. A change of residence without prior formalities would raise unnecessary questions." Aurelian nodded only once. Not with disappointment, but as one who takes note of a boundary he cannot cross, for now. "I understand," he said, without losing his serenity. Dumbledore seemed satisfied with his reaction. After a brief silence, he reached into his inner robe and pulled out a small black leather pouch, inconspicuous but clearly heavy. "Nevertheless, it seems only fair that you should be able to enjoy your last few weeks of freedom before school. Diagon Alley is open to you as long as you travel it discreetly." He handed her the bag unceremoniously, almost matter-of-factly. Aurelian took it, and as he felt the weight, he understood that it was not mere courtesy. It was confidence. "Don't abuse the ice cream," Dumbledore added with a half-smile, "and always return to the orphanage before dark. A young Gaunt disappearing without explanation would attract too many stares." Aurelian put the bag away wordlessly. He did not need to show his gratitude effusively. His look, brief but direct, was enough to communicate respect and understanding. "I'll keep that in mind, Professor." And so, amidst enchanted lights and the gentle vibration of a world on the brink of a new school year, the two continued on their way to the orphanage. The future awaited. "This is your ticket for the Hogwarts Express, platform 9 3/4. on the 1st of September. I will be waiting for you at the castle. Aurelian held the golden ticket carefully. The moment was real. The future was no longer a dream, a railway was waiting for him. Thank you, Professor, he said, lowering his gaze respectfully. Dumbledore gave him one last smile. I trust you, Aurelian. I will see you very soon. With a subtle flash, the Archmage disappeared. Aurelian stood in the doorway for a few more seconds, gazing up at the violet-tinted sky. Then he pressed the ticket and his wand to his chest, took a deep breath, and entered the orphanage for the last time like an ordinary child. Chapter 16 Chapter 16 King's Cross Station. During the month leading up to September, Aurelian divided his time with surgical precision between two worlds, the rigid and routine San Americo orphanage and Gaunt Manor, a sanctuary hidden from the world's gaze that was slowly becoming a physical reflection of his magic. At the orphanage, he maintained his usual facade, reserved, polite, distant. Nothing in his behavior betrayed the wizard in training that he really was. He responded politely, lost himself in his books, and returned punctually every time he left on the pretext of visiting the public library. No one suspected the secret he harbored. The Gaunt mansion was the opposite of the oppressive routine of the orphanage. It stood elegantly atop a hill surrounded by fog, hidden among twisted trees, its entrance flanked by two imposing statues of stone basilisks, guardians who welcomed visitors with silent majesty. Its exterior, although restored, retained an ancestral air. Dark tiles, small towers, and a reinforced magical fence surrounding the property made even the most daring wizards hesitate before approaching. But the truly extraordinary part was inside. The main halls, now renovated, had been decorated to Aurelian's taste, black and gold tapestries, endless shelves filled day by day with antique books that he selected with meticulous precision. Manuscripts on forgotten magic, writings on alchemy, lost rituals, grimoires of invocation, and even tomes on non-European magical cultures adorned the walls. Many of them were difficult to obtain, but Krivix took care of finding them, for the right price. Floating lamps gave off a soft light, and enchanted carpets muffled footsteps. In the dining room, a long oak table was crowned by a chandelier that emitted a warm blue light. In the personal library he was organizing himself, the books floated from shelf to shelf according to his preferred magical order, by subject, usefulness, and danger. In his daily life, Aurelian followed a meticulously established routine. He ate breakfast early in a kitchen renovated by magic. Then he spent the first hours of the morning reading or studying complex texts, taking notes, correcting theories. In the afternoons, he walked the corridors practicing basic spells, illusions, and slight adaptations of Muggle ideas that he tried to turn into functional magic spells. However, the core of his training was underground. The underground morning room, reinforced with containment runes and magical insulation, was his combat sanctuary. There, Aurelian practiced his original spells, perfected advanced shields, and trained with physical and magical intensity. The floor was marked by energy impacts. The walls, protected by regenerative barriers, bore witness to the growth of a self-taught wizard with unusual talent. It was there that his infinity was finally consolidated, now behaving like a real barrier that slowed down or even completely stopped any object or spell that tried to touch it. A defense as imposing as it was elegant, as magical as it was intuitive. In addition to training, Aurelian devoted time to the aesthetics and functionality of the mansion. He enchanted the portraits, designed the symbols that would decorate his personal spaces, and even began to draw a hidden map of the place for secret magical uses. Everything was being adapted not only as a home, but as the future headquarters of something much bigger. When he needed a break, he would return briefly to Diagon Alley, buy an ice cream, or sit and watch the wizards go about their business with a serene expression. He enjoyed the simple moments, not because they distracted him from his mission, but because they reminded him of his humanity, that delicate balance he had promised more than once never to break. That's how the last month before Hogwarts passed. Between spells, books, calculations, and silence. Aurelian Gaunt awaited his first step into a world that would soon know his name. September 1st dawned grey, with the sky covered in clouds that threatened lazy rain. Aurelian woke up before the old pendulum clock in the orphanage hall chimed. He dressed quietly, without haste or nostalgia, and prepared his magically expanded trunk, the same one Dumbledore had given him, with all his school supplies, new robes, books, pens, and parchments. He also packed a couple of extra books, one on magical history and another on intermediate spells that he had begun to annotate with his own corrections. When he closed the trunk with a soft click, he allowed himself one last look at the room he had occupied for years. It was simple. White walls, a hard bed, a small table, and a window that barely opened. A space he had never felt was his, but which, somehow, had shaped his discipline and patience. When he went down to the dining room, some of the caregivers were already serving breakfast. They offered him a condescending smile and kind words that didn't feel entirely sincere. He returned a nod. "Take care, Aurelian," said one of them. "Don't forget us when you become famous." He gave an enigmatic smile, neither cold nor warm, and walked out the front door carrying his trunk with the ease of someone who knows that his destiny lies beyond those walls. He walked to the nearest bus stop, where he waited among sleepy old people, mothers with impatient children, and yawning workers. The bus arrived on time. Aurelian got on, paid for his ticket in silence, and settled down by the window, with the trunk between his legs. The journey to King's Cross station was long, noisy, and mundane. Just the way he liked it. It reminded him that, although his goals were grand, his journey had to start from the bottom among ordinary people, without privileges. It was during that journey, with the engine rattling and automated announcements echoing every few minutes, that Aurelian made a silent but firm decision: he would not run. He would not investigate. He would not lead. Not yet. His first year at Hogwarts would be different. For once, he would live like a child his age. He would laugh when he wanted to, let himself be surprised by everyday things, answer questions in class as if he didn't know the answers in advance. He wanted to know what life was like without strategy, without calculation, without constant pressure. Not because he wanted to forget who he was, but because he knew that one day he would not be able to afford to live like that again. When the bus stopped in front of King's Cross, Aurelian calmly got off. The world did not know him yet, and for now, that was how it should be. He adjusted his coat, grabbed the handle of his trunk, and disappeared into the crowd of muggles as naturally as a cat slips into the shadows. He smiled, as if sharing a secret that only he knew. The hustle and bustle at King's Cross station was deafening. Aurelian, accustomed to the calculated silence of Gaunt Manor and the orderly murmur of the orphanage, immersed himself in the human mass with a neutral expression, as if everything around him were part of a scene he had already studied. Most people did not notice the dark-haired boy with the deep gaze who was dragging a sturdy trunk with surprising ease. He avoided drawing attention to himself, but his eyes moved constantly, observing. Entire families said goodbye to their children, some crying, others laughing nervously. Aurelian walked straight to the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, looked both ways, sighed softly, and crossed it. As he crossed, a warm blast greeted him, steam from the train, youthful voices, the smell of sweets, a sky clearer than that of the city. Platform 9 3/4 was everything he had imagined in his readings and more. The Hogwarts Express, imposing and bright red, emitted a long whistle as if it too were celebrating the arrival of a new school year. Aurelian didn't stop to look around too much. He made his way naturally through groups of students and parents. A couple of small children in knitted hats were arguing about the size of their owls. A tall girl, with a proud expression in a perfectly ironed robe, was already arranging her luggage with the help of a house elf. When he boarded the train, a conductor greeted him distractedly, without paying much attention to him. Aurelian walked down the aisles looking for an empty compartment. It wasn't that he wanted to avoid the others, he just wanted to observe first. The interior of the train smelled of leather, chocolate, and a hint of dampness. The wood creaked under his feet as the voices grew fainter. He passed by compartments that were full, others that were half occupied, until he found an empty one at the back of the car. He opened it, stepped inside, and closed the door gently. He placed his trunk in the luggage rack and sat down by the window. For a moment, he let his body relax. His heart was beating fast, not from nerves, but from anticipation. He looked through the glass as steam began to rise around the train. Hogwarts, he thought, the stage where it all will begin. But for now, for a while, Aurelian Gaunt would just be another student. The train whistle blew loudly and long, making the windows rattle. Aurelian watched with a neutral expression as the platform receded, shrouded in steam and murmurs. The Hogwarts Express had departed, marking the beginning of a new life. He had already settled into his seat, alone, watching the landscape begin to unfold beyond the window, when he heard a knock on the compartment door. "May I come in?" asked a voice on the other side. Aurelian looked up. He opened the door with a slight spell without a wand, discreetly, as if it had moved by accident. On the other side was a boy with light brown hair, friendly features, and a sincere gleam in his eyes. He was dressed in simple robes, but the first-year label was visible on his trunk. "My name is Cedric Diggory," he introduced himself with a smile. "I'm a first year. All the compartments are full or too noisy, and I saw that this one was free. May I sit down?" Aurelian nodded politely. "Sure. I'm Aurelian." Cedric put down his trunk and sat down across from him. "Are you nervous?" he asked curiously. "A little," Aurelian replied, carefully measuring his tone. "But also excited." Cedric nodded vigorously. "Me too. I wonder which house I'll be sorted into. My dad was a Hufflepuff, but he told me that the important thing is to enjoy yourself and learn, not which house you're in." Aurelian watched silently for a second. There was something comforting about Cedric's honesty. Rarely in his short but intense life had he met someone so transparent. "We'll see what the sorting hat decides," he said to himself in a whisper with a small smile. For the rest of the journey, they talked casually. Cedric shared his enthusiasm for Hogwarts, his doubts, his fascination with flying lessons and duels. Aurelian, on the other hand, measured every word, but silently appreciated the company. It was nice to feel like a child for a few moments. The train continued its journey, winding its way through meadows and hills, while two future students unknowingly forged the first bond of a friendship yet to be defined. Chapter 17 Chapter 17 The selection ceremony. The train whistled loudly one last time before coming to a complete stop at Hogsmeade Station. Excitement and nervousness vibrated in the air as the students hurriedly got off, dragging their trunks and holding their pets, bundled up against the cold Scottish air. Aurelian stepped off the train with steady strides, his gaze sweeping the surroundings with calculated calm. Distant mountains, a sky covered with thick clouds, and the smell of damp earth that heralded the approach of autumn. At his side, Cedric Diggory smiled with infectious enthusiasm, observing everything as if he were in a dream. "First years, this way," boomed a deep, powerful voice belonging to a gigantic man with a thick beard and small but warm eyes. "All first years, follow me." It was Rubeus Hagrid, the gamekeeper. Aurelian recognized him from the reports he had read, although in this timeline he seemed even more burly than in his memories of another life. Without a word, Aurelian joined the group of children following Hagrid down a path lit by magical lanterns. Soon, the view opened up to the immense, dark lake, its waters still and deep as a mirror. "Four to a boat," ordered Hagrid, pointing to the enchanted boats floating without anchors. Aurelian elegantly climbed into one of them. Cedric joined him immediately, and soon two other children silently followed suit. The boat rocked gently as they boarded, and in an instant, it began to move forward on its own, gliding across the surface of the lake as if floating in the air. The night was silent. Only the whisper of the water and the murmurs of the students accompanied the journey. Then the castle appeared. Majestic, immense, unshakable. The illuminated towers of Hogwarts rose against the sky like a magical beacon dominating the landscape, their reflection trembling in the black waters of the lake. Aurelian, for a moment, stopped thinking. He didn't analyze, he didn't calculate. He just gazed. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a hint of what might have been wonder. "Impressive, isn't it?" whispered Cedric. Aurelian didn't answer. He just nodded very slightly. The boats continued on their way to the base of a large stone staircase, where the students descended in single file, guided by Hagrid's imposing silhouette. "Come on. The ceremony is about to start," he said. Aurelian clenched his fingers around the enchanted trunk he carried beside him. His face, almost always inscrutable, now wore an expression that was impossible to define. It wasn't fear. It wasn't excitement. It was a strange mixture of determination and longing. Because Hogwarts wasn't just a school. The group of first-year students, still drenched in excitement from the boat ride, was led by Hagrid to the grand staircase that led to the castle entrance. The ancient stones of the threshold glistened with moisture, and magical torches danced in their holders with a warm and welcoming flame. There, waiting for them at the foot of a majestic oak door, stood a tall witch with a stern but serene face and an immaculate emerald robe that contrasted with her brown hair pulled back into a tight bun. "Professor McGonagall," said Hagrid, with a smile and a respectful gesture. "Here are the new ones." The witch nodded gravely. "Thank you, Hagrid. You may leave," she replied in a firm voice. Aurelian fixed his eyes on her. She wasn't the McGonagall he remembered from the books. This woman had youthful features, a sharp gaze, and a presence that radiated effortless authority. She looked closer to 40 than 70, and although her voice had the same energy he knew, her appearance was another story. "They're all different," Aurelian thought as he hit a slow exhalation. "Younger, more powerful, more difficult to predict." A chill ran down his spine. Not from fear, but from caution. With every step he took in the magical world, he had to re-evaluate what he thought he knew. "Welcome to Hogwarts," said Professor McGonagall, her gaze scanning the students scrutinizingly. "In a few minutes, you will enter the Great Hall, where it will be determined which house you will belong to. During your time here, your house will be like your family, you will attend classes together, sleep in the same dormitories, and share points and responsibilities." Cedric, at his side, seemed to be holding his breath. "Wait here for a moment. When everything is ready, I will let you in," McGonagall said in a firm voice, before turning and disappearing behind large double doors. "Did you notice? She seems like someone very strict." Aurelian barely turned his face to look at him, with a slight smile. "And it probably is," he replied calmly, "although that's not necessarily a bad thing." Cedric nodded, somewhat calmer. Aurelian remained silent, his gaze fixed on the closed doors. Every step he took in this world reaffirmed what he already sensed: he was not living a familiar story. Everything was familiar and strange at the same time. The large doors of the dining hall opened with a slight creak of magic and stone, revealing a monumental room lit by hundreds of floating candles. The ceiling, enchanted to reflect the night sky, displayed a starry firmament that seemed to pulsate with promise. Aurelian held his breath for a moment. The Great Hall. It was just like in the books. And yet, at the same time, it was different. The tables of the four houses were as long as he remembered, filled with students in black robes and shiny shields. Their faces laughed, whispered, and watched the newcomers with curiosity. But there were more students. Many more than were seen in movies or suggested in books. Without reaching impossible numbers, the number was significantly higher. Aurelian made a quick calculation as they advanced in single file toward the front of the dining hall. This makes more sense. If wizards live longer, more people, more countries collaborating, then of course there must be more children. But there aren't as many as I expected. He glanced discreetly at the teachers at the high table. Dumbledore was already seated in the center, talking to McGonagall, who had just arrived. On either side, other teachers flanked him, some familiar from books, others completely new. But what was most intriguing was that they all had a more intense, more steadfast aura, as if magical standards had been raised in this reality. Cedric, walking beside him, murmured, "Wow, this is huge." "Yes," Aurelian nodded, still observing Hogwarts in all its glory. When they reached the front, they found an old stool with a worn hat. Aurelian could feel the slight tingle of ancient magic. The Sorting Hat awaited. The ceremony was about to begin. In front of the Sorting Hat, the first-year students lined up in a single row, nervously watching the bench and the patched hat resting on it. Suddenly, the hat shook, with a magical yawn, and began to sing. The song spoke of the four houses, their virtues, their values, the challenges of the new year. Aurelian listened quietly, analyzing every word. That magic had a higher pitch than expected, as if it knew more than it was saying. When the hat finished its song, McGonagall reappeared with a long scroll and began to call out, "Stimpson, Patricia." A nervous blonde girl walked up to the hat and was quickly sent to Hufflepuff. "Caro, Flora." One of the next to step forward was a girl with jet black hair and intense eyes. She climbed onto the stool with contained confidence, put on the hat, and after a few seconds, it shouted, "Slytherin." The teacher continued, "Caro, Hestia." Another girl, identical to the previous one, stepped forward right after her. She was also sent to Slytherin. Aurelian frowned slightly. They were twins, although he couldn't be sure, there was something about their faces that seemed eerily familiar. It can't be. Could they be the same girls I saved in Diagon Alley, he thought, suppressing a shiver. They look older in their uniforms, but the expression in their eyes. The list continued, Diggory, Cedric. Cedric rose with a determined stride. Aurelian watched him closely. The hat took a little longer this time, muttering unintelligible things, and then shouted, "Hufflepuff." Cedric turned, smiling broadly, and was greeted with warm applause at his table. Fred Weasley. A red-haired boy ran up with a mischievous smile. The hat barely touched his head when it shouted, "Gryffindor." "George Weasley," called the teacher. The next to go up was his identical brother. The hat took barely more than a second. "Gryffindor." McGonagall continued with several other names as Aurelian watched the houses fill up. Ravenclaw seemed particularly selective, and Slytherin welcomed its new members with controlled smiles and measured applause. Finally, after a few more, the voice rang out, "Gaunt, Aurelian." There was a brief silence in the dining hall. The name Gaunt did not go unnoticed. Some teachers exchanged glances. At the Slytherin table, one of the prefects frowned with interest. Aurelian stepped forward calmly, controlling every emotion on his face. He knew everyone was watching him. He knew the hat could read more than he was showing. But he also knew he was ready. He sat down. The hat covered his eyes. Then, the ancient voice spoke to him in his mind. As soon as the hat touched his head, a deep, gravelly voice echoed directly inside him. "Interesting, very interesting. It's not every day you meet someone with such a sharp mind." Aurelian didn't respond. He just remained calm, allowing the hat to rummage through his most superficial thoughts. A disciplined mind, reinforced. A clemency at this age. "I see, there are secrets here. Many. More than anyone your age should have." A pause. "And magic, original magic. Theory built from scratch. What a peculiar young man you are." Aurelian thought coldly. "Don't show too much. But show enough so as not to appear suspicious." "Ambitious, no doubt. But it's not just ambition here. You have purpose. An iron will. You want to build, master, understand, even the roots of magic. But there is also compassion, albeit buried. Genuine curiosity. Protection. You care more than you admit. And that confuses you. Aurelian thought calmly. The hat let out a mental laugh. Oh, not at all. It just makes my job more complicated. You have the ingenuity of a Ravenclaw, the willpower of a Gryffindor, the fortitude of a Hufflepuff, and the lineage, of course. Gaunt. Ancient blood. Dark. Yet, you are not like them. Aurelian did not respond, but a silent pang pierced his thoughts. The figure of his father, shrouded in shadows, crossed his mind, then dissipated. You are not your father, but there are fragments of something deeper, older within you. Something that makes you unique. You could become great in any house, you know that. But there is a place where you will grow up among those who understand power, strategy, history. In Slytherin, you will be able to act from the shadows when necessary, build without attracting attention, protect what matters to you, and if you want to change this world, it will be easier to start from there. Aurelian exhaled slowly in his mind. He said nothing. But his decision was made even before he stepped up to the bench. The hat knew it. In a firm, resonant voice, it shouted to the dining hall, Slytherin. The great hall rumbled with murmurs and whispers as Aurelian stepped down from the bench. He walked calmly, without haste, without seeking eye contact with anyone. Even so, he felt every gaze fixed on the back of his neck. From the teacher's table, Snape watched him with the same intensity with which one studies a potion. McGonagall kept her face neutral, but her slightly furrowed brow betrayed a mixture of recognition and doubt. Dumbledore, for his part, had that calm smile, although his blue eyes shone with a calculating light. Aurelian made his way to the Slytherin table, where the students greeted him with an almost ceremonial silence. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with respect. A couple of older students exchanged a brief glance, but no one said anything as Aurelian took his seat. He took a deep breath. Everything was going according to plan. If he kept a low profile, his first year would be useful for understanding the terrain. That was when he noticed a couple of different looks. He glanced up briefly. Further down the table, two girls his age were talking quietly. Hestia and Flora Caro, he had heard. Both had dark hair pulled back neatly, perfectly arranged uniforms, and a composure unusual for someone their age. They seemed focused on their conversation, but, for a moment, he thought he noticed one of them glance briefly in his direction. It was just a blink of an eye. A gesture that might have gone unnoticed if it weren't for the slight blush that appeared on one of their cheeks. The other maintained her composure, although there was a slight break in her tone, as if her mind had suddenly been drawn to another memory. Aurelian narrowed his eyes. Curious, he thought, but dismissed the thought. I'm sure they're watching me just like everyone else. He turned his gaze back to his plate, feigning interest in the pumpkin bread. This was no time to think about strange girls. The great hall erupted in applause when another student was sent to Hufflepuff, and the selection continued without further interruption. Aurelian ate in silence, attentive to everything and everyone. Meanwhile, a few rows ahead, the twins continued talking to each other as if nothing had happened, although, deep in their eyes, something had changed since they saw him. Chapter 18 Chapter 18 First day the banquet in the Great Hall was coming to an end. The trays that had once been overflowing with magical food began to disappear in the blink of an eye, leaving room for a soft enchanted mist that descended from the enchanted ceiling, which continued to mimic the starry sky of that cool September night. Aurelian had eaten little, more out of caution than lack of appetite. Every gesture, every voice, every detail of the atmosphere offered him new information, and the opportunity to analyze it all kept him more entertained than any dessert. Welcome, once again, to a new year at Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore's voice broke the anticipation with serenity, projected with magic. I hope this banquet has satisfied your stomachs and that the coming year will nourish your minds with equal generosity. The murmurs ceased instantly. I don't have too many warnings this year, he continued with a smile, except to remind you that the Forbidden Forest remains strictly off-limits to all students. It is called that for good reason, and no, it is not a challenge for the brave or an opportunity for the curious. A wave of giggles rippled through some of the older students, and Dumbledore raised his glass. May this year be one of learning, discovery, and perhaps a little chaos. Welcome home. The great hall erupted in applause, and the prefects began to rise to lead the first-year students to their respective common rooms. Aurelian stood discreetly and looked around for those who would lead the Slytherin group. 2 figures dressed in green insignia waited for them by the doors. Attention, first-year Slytherins, follow us, ordered a tall, thin boy with a long face. His tone was calm but authoritative. I am Cassian Mulciber, and this is Selene Rosier. We are your prefects this year. Selene, a young woman with jet-black hair and eyes as sharp as daggers, nodded politely, though her expression seemed permanently inquisitive. Walk quickly. The dungeons won't wait, Cassian added without turning around. The group of students made their way through the castle's corridors, descending stone staircases and passing through hallways dimly lit by floating torches. Aurelian walked silently, attentive to the route and the faces of his new companions. The cold stone walls seemed to whisper secrets from the past. As they descended deeper and deeper, the air became more humid, and the distant murmur of Black Lake seemed to envelop them with its invisible presence. They reflected a faint greenish light cast by enchanted torches. They stopped in front of a smooth, damp section of wall. Purus intentus, Cassian said in a firm voice. The wall slid aside with a hissing whisper, revealing the entrance to the Slytherin common room, an elegant chamber carved from dark stone, with Gothic arches, green furniture with silver trim, and large windows offering a partial view of the bottom of the lake. Shadows of sea creatures glided across the glass. The Slytherin common room is located beneath the Black Lake. That's why you'll notice the cooler atmosphere, and sometimes you'll see shadows of creatures swimming on the ceilings, Cassian said with a half-smile. Aurelian looked up with interest. The polished stone walls curved to form a wide, low ceiling, and a greenish light filtered through the enchanted windows that looked directly into the depths of the lake. Silver tapestries embroidered with snakes hung between the columns, and dark armchairs offered seating in front of a long fireplace crackling with emerald flames. Selene Rosier, gentler than her companion, pointed to a small curved staircase. The single bedrooms are ready for each student. At Slytherin, we value privacy and study, so everyone will have their own space. The rooms are numbered by year. Aurelian received a floating key that magically slid into his hand, adorned with a small brass snake coiled around a perfectly engraved one. First year, room 7, Selene indicated with a friendly but distant gesture. Aurelian climbed the stairs in silence. The hallway was narrow, but each door was made of heavy wood with bronze fittings, solid as if hiding ancient secrets. When he opened his, he found a neat room with dark furniture, a large bed with green velvet sheets, a desk, an empty bookcase, and an enchanted window that showed the bottom of the lake like a moving mural. The young Gaunt walked to the center, set his trunk on the stand, and sat on the edge of the bed. Silence, shadow, depth. He thought. An ideal environment. He took out his notebook, wrote a couple of lines of an unfinished theory, then closed it gently. He turned off the lights with a snap of his fingers, leaving the room in darkness, illuminated only by the blue-green light of the lake. As he settled under the blankets, his mind wandered, he reviewed spells, names of classmates, and the layout of the castle. He had everything planned out. However, a slight smile appeared on his face. Tomorrow was his first day as a student at Hogwarts. Underscore 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 underscore. The greenish light filtering from the bottom of the lake danced softly on the stone ceiling when Aurelian opened his eyes. He didn't need an alarm clock. Habit, self-discipline, and his ever-alert mind woke him before dawn. He went to the bathroom to get ready, dressed in his new Hogwarts robe, carefully adjusting the Slytherin emblem. With a wave of his wand, he tidied the folds of his bed, combed his hair, and left his room in complete silence. The stone corridors were damp but pleasant. Aurelian arrived at the common room with a calm stride. He was one of the first to arrive, as he expected. In front of the emerald fireplace, with his arms crossed and a stern expression, Severus Snape waited. His black robe seemed to absorb the light from the room, and his gaze was as sharp as ever. "First years, come forward," he said in a low but perfectly audible voice. His tone was enough to make the few students present straighten their backs. Aurelian approached, followed by other students from his year, all newly risen and still sleepy. He assessed them without paying too much attention. For now, he wasn't interested in any of them. Snape unrolled a scroll with the weekly schedules. "Classes begin today. You will have potions with me in the dungeons, twice a week. Transfiguration with Professor McGonagall, charms with Flitwick, herbology in the greenhouses with Sprout, A&D. He paused briefly, with undisguised disdain. "Defense against the dark arts with Professor Lucanroll." Aurelian raised an eyebrow slightly. He didn't remember that name from his readings about the wizarding world. "A new player, then. You will also have astronomy in the evenings and broomstick flying with Professor Hooch. Keep track of your schedules and don't be late. Not all teachers are as tolerant as I am," he added with barely veiled sarcasm. One by one, the individual schedules floated from the parchment to the students. Aurelian took his with a mechanical gesture, quickly reviewing it. His first class would be that morning, Transfiguration with McGonagall. As the others dispersed silently toward the great hall, Aurelian put away the parchment and breathed calmly. The cold of the dungeons was comforting to him. The great hall was already filled with light when Aurelian crossed its doors. The enchanted ceiling showed the clear morning sky, with faint clouds drifting gently overhead. The long tables of the houses were beginning to fill with students talking quietly and eating heartily, still acclimating to the first day. Aurelian slid naturally into the Slytherin table, sitting at one end with no immediate company. A plate appeared in front of him and began to magically fill with toast, scrambled eggs, and pumpkin juice. As he poured himself some tea, his gaze drifted, as usual, to the other tables. Then his eyes met those of Cedric Diggory, who was sitting at the Hufflepuff table, not far away. Cedric recognized him immediately and raised a hand, greeting him with a friendly and genuine smile. Aurelian nodded softly in response. He was not one to show public affection, but in Cedric he had found a simple and genuine presence. It was pleasant to deal with someone who did not seek to manipulate, impress, or hide behind masks. That alone made him valuable. Shortly thereafter, while Aurelian calmly cut a slice of bread with jam, Cedric rose from his table, carrying a cup in his hand. He approached the other end of the great hall, stopping near him, though respecting the separation between houses. "First day, hey," Cedric commented in a friendly tone. "Looks like we survived the hat." Aurelian raised an eyebrow, amused. "Not everyone comes out unscathed," he said quietly. "Some take years to recover from what they hear." Cedric let out a slight laugh. "First class. Transfiguration," Aurelian replied, sipping his tea. "Same here. See you there, then." The boy said goodbye with a casual gesture and returned to his table. Aurelian followed him with his gaze for just a moment. The Transfiguration classroom was located on the first floor, with stone walls well lit by large windows that let in the morning light. The wooden tables were perfectly aligned, each with an inkwell and a blank parchment waiting for instructions. Aurelian was one of the first to enter. He chose a seat in the second row, neither too far forward nor too far back. Cedric arrived shortly after, sitting down next to him with a brief smile. Other first-year students took their seats more awkwardly, some still adjusting their robes or frantically checking their supplies. At 9 o'clock sharp, the door opened with a soft click. Professor Minerva McGonagall entered silently, her confident footsteps echoing with authority. She wore an immaculate emerald robe, her dark hair pulled back neatly. She looked young, firm, and serene, with a piercing gaze that swept across the classroom without the need for words. Aurelian noticed it clearly again. This was not the McGonagall he remembered from his other life, there was something more polished, more restrained about this version. She seemed even more demanding, and more powerful. "Good morning, class," she said in a firm, clear voice. "Welcome to your first day of transfiguration. This subject is one of the most complex and dangerous branches of magic you will study at Hogwarts. I will not tolerate distractions, jokes, or carelessness. If you are here, it is because you are expected to rise to the occasion." There was complete silence. Even the most talkative students seemed to shrink a little in their seats. "Today we will start with the basics, turning matches into sewing needles. It's not glamorous, but it will teach you the fundamentals of control, intention, and precision, which are at the core of magical transformation." With a wave of her wand, several boxes of matches floated across the classroom and landed in front of each student. Aurelian took one without haste. It wasn't a difficult feat for him. But he decided it was best to control the execution. Enough to stand out, but without appearing superhuman. McGonagall gave step-by-step instructions, guiding the students with precision. Cedric muttered a couple of times under his breath, frustrated with his match, while Aurelian made small adjustments to his, until finally the wood crackled and transformed into a thin silver needle. "Not perfect, but passable." "Very good, Mr. Gaunt," said McGonagall, passing by his table. "A stable result, albeit hasty. Have you practiced before?" "Only what can be deduced from theory," he replied calmly. The hallway leading from the Transfiguration classroom to the main hall was quiet, carpeted by a dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. The conversations of the other students mingled with the echo of hurried footsteps and books under their arms. Aurelian walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his robe neat, his expression serene. Transforming matter. How interesting, he thought, mentally reviewing the process they had just practiced. But so limited. So superficial. Barely a hint of what magic can truly do. It was not arrogance that spoke within him, but the awareness of having traveled older, darker, and deeper paths. However, there was beauty in the basics. In the elemental. He could feel how his magic, now assisted by a wand, was channeled with a different, more refined fluidity. "Hey, Aurelian!" Cedric's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. The boy caught up with him, smiling, slightly sweaty from walking quickly. "Didn't you think McGonagall was intense?" "She's precise," Aurelian replied with a small smile. "She expects nothing less from her students." Cedric chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Well, I've got my work cut out for me if I want to keep up with you." They walked a few yards together. Cedric talked about how imposing the castle was, how easy it was to get lost, how much he hoped the classes wouldn't all be so demanding. Aurelian listened, mostly in silence, with calm attention. "What do you think?" Cedric asked him suddenly. "Of Hogwarts?" Aurelian thought about it for a few seconds. Then he replied, without taking his eyes off the curved corridor in front of them. "It's a place where every stone seems to have a memory, and every shadow a secret." "I like that." Cedric looked at him sideways, intrigued. "You're weird, Aurelian," he said with a friendly laugh. "But not in a bad way. I like you." Aurelian paused for a moment, looking him straight in the eye. "Don't you mind my last name?" Cedric frowned, confused. Your last name? Gaunt. Cedric thought for a few seconds. The name wasn't exactly famous among the students, but Aurelian imagined that rumors would already have started to circulate. Pure blood, ancient lineage, dark rumors. And yet... No, Cedric replied honestly. I don't care. I care about who you are. Aurelian looked at him intently, as if weighing the true meaning of that answer. Then he nodded slowly, a slight curve forming at the corners of his lips. Then I like you more than I thought I would. Cedric smiled. That was a compliment, right? As close as I can get to giving one, Aurelian joked, and they both resumed walking, turning together onto a moving staircase. They didn't know it yet, but in that hallway, with that simple conversation, something more than schoolyard camaraderie was being forged. It was the birth of a genuine friendship. Forged not by blood, house, or prestige, but by the simple fact of seeing and accepting each other honestly. And for Aurelian, that was more valuable than he dared admit. Chapter 19 Life in the castle. 2 weeks had passed since Aurelian first walked through the gates of Hogwarts, and the castle was already beginning to reveal itself to him, like a living creature deciding whom to show its secrets to. The school routine did not exhaust him, on the contrary, he found it comfortable, almost relaxing. Waking up early, going down for breakfast amid the murmur of students, walking through the stone corridors under the dim light of floating chandeliers, everything had a charming cadence that contrasted with the much more intense days he used to live at Gaunt Manor. This is simpler, he thought more than once. A temporary respite, but a valuable one. During classes, Aurelian behaved like a diligent and curious student, though without drawing too much attention to himself. He was not the first to raise his hand, nor the last to answer. He made sure to stay within the margins of the remarkable. Sometimes, however, his answers were so precise, so strangely profound, that the teachers raised an eyebrow or paused before continuing. Minerva McGonagall, in particular, was already watching him with growing interest. Snape, on the other hand, seemed harder to impress, but Aurelian noticed that he never took his eyes off him. The castle corridors had become his second study. He walked through them with confident steps, memorizing routes, discreetly testing the hidden accesses he found in the library books. Sometimes he stayed awake in the common room long after the others had gone to sleep, reading scrolls, writing notes to himself, mentally rehearsing new magical schemes. The other students were beginning to form an opinion of him. He was reserved, polite, incredibly intelligent, and difficult to read. Aurelian didn't talk much, but when he did, his words carried weight. Cedric Diggory had become his closest friend. They would sometimes meet to eat together, study in the library, or simply walk through the gardens when the weather permitted. Cedric was the perfect balance, warm, honest, without the twisted ambition that some Slytherins were beginning to show. That night, Aurelian stopped in front of one of the fifth-floor windows. The sky was covered with stars, and the black lake reflected the moonlight. 2 weeks, he murmured softly. I can already feel how this place is trying to mold me. But it wouldn't be that easy. Aurelian was already molded. He wasn't a child who had come to learn magic. He was a wizard disguised as a child, waiting for the right moment to awaken his potential. Let the world see me as just another one. He thought as his fingers gently brushed the edge of his wand, until I decide it's time to show them who I am. With one last glance at the sky, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. Aurelian had just left the library, where he had been consulting a text on the theoretical foundations of expansion spells. Although the book in question was full of restrictions and warnings regarding its use on minors, he had already made a mental note of the key principles that he would later apply to his own projects. As he crossed the corridor connecting the library to the main staircase, a strange sound snapped him out of his thoughts, a subtle crackling, followed by an insistent PSSST. Hey, you, whispered a voice from behind a suit of armor. You look like you don't ask many questions. Want to see something fun? Aurelian stopped dead in his tracks. He narrowed his eyes. From behind the armor emerged two identical faces, red-haired, smiling, and mischievous. Fred and George Weasley, they introduced themselves in unison, as if it were a single word. "How do you know I'm someone who doesn't ask many questions?" Aurelian asked with a slight smile, crossing his arms. "You have a bitter look on your face," said Fred. "You're one of those people who listen more than they talk," added George. "We like you. We like people like that," they said at the same time, coming out of hiding completely. Aurelian looked at them more closely. He had noticed their presence at the welcome banquet, of course, but he hadn't had a chance to interact with them. Now that he had them in front of him, his suspicions were confirmed. They were like two perfectly synchronized bombs waiting to explode. Different from Cedric. More disorderly, but also more authentic. "And what do you want to show me?" he asked with genuine interest. "A secret passageway to the kitchen," said Fred enthusiastically. "We snuck in this morning and got some pumpkin pie." "There's more," added George with a knowing smile. "But we're not going for food now, no. Now we're going to check if Filch really sleeps during the day," they both concluded, looking at him as if they had offered him a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Aurelian watched them silently for a few seconds. He could refuse, of course. He had homework, books to read, and a routine he didn't want to break. But he was also certain that getting to know people like the Weasleys well could be useful. Besides, a well-planned raid wouldn't hurt him. It was all part of getting to know the terrain. "All right," he finally said, with a slight smile. "But if we get caught, you guys talk first." Fred and George looked at each other, laughing as if they already knew that wouldn't happen. "That's right, my friend," said Fred as they set off. "That's the Gryffindor spirit." "Too bad you're in Slytherin," added George. "But hey, the snake may be cunning, but it also knows when to bite." With one last laugh, they disappeared together around a corner in the hallway, dragging Aurelian with them on their little adventure. Night had fallen over Hogwarts like a silent blanket. The portraits slumbered in their frames and the chandeliers flickered with a deceptive calm. Aurelian slipped behind the Weasley twins down one of the third-floor corridors, following their footsteps like a silent shadow. Fred consulted an old parchment that seemed to react with animated spots to every movement. "Is that a map?" Aurelian asked quietly. "The best," George whispered. "It's called the Marauder's Map. Don't ask how we got it. It was signed by Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs," Fred added with a proud smile. "Pure history." Aurelian nodded, making a mental note of those names. The map accurately showed the castle's corridors and the location of every person inside it, including the three of them. It also showed that Filch was in the east wing of the castle, muttering to himself as he walked down a corridor with his cat. "All clear," George murmured. "This way." He led them to a dusty tapestry that concealed an opening in the wall. Fred knocked 3 times in a specific pattern, and it slid aside as if the castle were inviting them in. Behind it was a narrow spiral staircase leading down to the lower level. Aurelian analyzed it instantly: hidden location, restricted access, no detectable magical presence. An excellent entry point. When they reached the bottom, they walked down a passageway to a door that opened directly onto a corridor adjacent to the kitchens. Fred knocked again with the right pattern, and the three of them entered, coming out just behind a row of shelves filled with ingredients. The house elves were busy with their nightly cleaning, though one of them looked up when he saw them. Aurelian gave him a steady look, barely a gesture, and the elf blinked, then simply continued working. "Not a word." "You've got something weird in your eyes, you know," whispered George, peering over a glass of pumpkin juice. "You say a lot without saying anything," added Fred, intimidating but firm. They found what they had been promised: pumpkin pies, several chocolate frogs, and even a forgotten jug of butterbeer. They sat on the floor, among barrels and sacks of flour, eating by the dim light of a floating candle. Aurelian, for his part, remained silent, watching the twins as they joked, laughed, and planned future mischief. Were they always like this? He asked suddenly. Like what? Asked Fred, his mouth full. Happy. Friendly. As if nothing could crush them. Both stopped. George was the first to answer, this time without laughter. It hasn't all been easy. But if we don't take it with humor, how are we supposed to take it? Fred nodded with a half-smile. If we're going to make history, we might as well do it laughing, right? Aurelian looked down, thoughtful. It was such a different approach from his own, yet he couldn't help but feel respect for them. Thanks for bringing me, he said at last. You're one of us, even if you don't know it, said George, toasting with a chocolate frog. A little darker, maybe, added Fred, but we like you, Snake. When they returned to their respective common rooms, the castle was already fast asleep. Before closing his eyes that night, Aurelian thought about that secret meal, the laughter, the way Hogwarts had a way of giving him unexpected pieces for his future. The sky above Hogwarts was covered with soft clouds that filtered the sunlight into silvery tones. A light breeze stirred the water of the great lake, stretching like an uneven mirror toward the mountainous horizon. Aurelian was on the shore, his robe loosened, lying on the damp grass. His arms were crossed under his head and his eyes were closed, enjoying the silence. It was one of those rare moments, no homework, no classes, no questions. Just him, with the whisper of the wind and the calm swaying of the water. Then he heard footsteps. He opened one eye just as 3 first-year Slytherin students approached. He recognized them, first Octavian Muldoon, a tall, thin, pale boy with aristocratic manners and an ever-condescending tone, Thalia Burke, with hair curly as a nest of shadows, a shrewd gaze, and a perpetually critical expression, and Ronan Traverse, burly, with the empty smile of someone who only follows the group out of habit. Well, said Octavian, raising an eyebrow as if he had just discovered an exotic creature, the famous Aurelian Gaunt, alone by the lake. How poetic! Aurelian did not move. He only turned his face slightly to get a better look at them. And you are? Octavian Muldoon. These are Thalia and Ronan. All pure bloods. All Slytherins. We thought it would be good to get to know you better, since you clearly stand out. Stand out? Aurelian asked without showing any emotion. Professor Sinistrom mentioned you in astronomy class, Thalia interjected, crossing her arms. You said something about star patterns and magical cycles, and she seemed intrigued. It's not common for someone to say something like that in their first year. Besides, Octavian added with a half-smile, if you really are a Gaunt, there are those who believe you could represent something important. It's not every day that an heir to an almost extinct line appears. Ronan lagged behind, watching the lake, clearly more interested in the frogs jumping on the rocks than in the conversation. Aurelian rose slowly, brushing the grass from his shoulder. His face was serene, but his eyes shone with an icy edge. And what do they really want? Allies, Octavian replied bluntly. Hogwarts isn't as innocent as it seems. The first years quickly form groups, and it's better to have friends than enemies. We prefer to surround ourselves with people who know how to act intelligently, added Thalia. And you seem strategically convenient. Aurelian watched them for a few seconds. Then he smiled, barely. Do you know what the most common mistake of those who think they are strategists is? Octavian frowned. Believing that others are not. There was a thick silence. Finally, Aurelian stood up, with a practiced calm, and said, I appreciate the interest. But I don't like imposed alliances or loyalties of convenience. If at some point we prove to be useful to each other, I'll know. For now, I prefer to observe. Octavian tried to maintain his composure, but Thalia smiled slightly, amused. Interesting answer, she said. Without further ado, the three turned and walked away, their green robes fluttering behind them. Aurelian, however, looked back at the lake. Chapter 20 Truths we leave out. Aurelian walked through the stone corridors with his Defense Against the Dark Arts book tucked securely under his arm. Torches flickered as he passed, casting wandering shadows on the enchanted walls of Hogwarts. In the distance, the door to the classroom in the East Wing was already open, and some students were settling into their seats with curious and tense murmurs. Defense Against the Dark Arts. A subject that represented everything Aurelian knew he would one day have to face. The professor in charge of teaching it was Lucan Roll. A name with weight, Aurelian thought as he entered. From the first class, Professor Roll had made an impression on him that was difficult to describe. He was a man who appeared to be middle-aged, with dark hair combed back, an angular face, and permanently furrowed eyebrows. He had a different air about him, but his movements were martial, as if his body could not help but remember old battles. He was not a warm man. Nor was he friendly. But he was not a monster either. In previous classes, Roll had not wasted time with unnecessary greetings. He had started the course directly with basic defensive techniques and obscure theory, mixing brief explanations with compelling examples. His eyes scanned the students as if measuring their potential with every sentence he uttered. Aurelian watched him closely. The professor was neither an orator nor a pure theorist. He moved and spoke like someone who had seen things. Someone who taught not out of vocation, but out of necessity. He's a warrior who found refuge in teaching, Aurelian had concluded a few days earlier. That inspired respect, but also questions. As he took his seat next to Cedric, Aurelian looked over at the desk. There was Roll, sorting parchments without looking up. "Have you ever seen him smile?" Cedric whispered. "No. But if he did, it would probably be even scarier," Aurelian replied calmly. Class was about to begin, and Aurelian, without taking his eyes off the professor, thought, in this vast and dangerous world, knowing how to defend yourself is not an option. It's a necessity. "Close your books," Roll ordered in a firm voice, pacing in front of the class with his hands behind his back. "Today, we're going to talk about something that isn't in your textbooks. But if you ever want to survive outside these walls, you need to understand it." Heads rose, expectant. "There are 5 officially recognized ranks of magical power," he began. "An ancient classification system, perfected by the Wizards of Avalon and confirmed centuries later by the International Confederation of Wizards. It has nothing to do with your house, your lineage, or your grades. It has to do with what you are capable of doing with your magic." He raised his wand and with a gesture drew 5 words in the air, shining like white fire: "Initiate, Conjurer, Invoker, Archmage, Sage." The first rank, Initiate, is that of every child who begins by doing magic accidentally, he explained. This level represents a basic connection to magical energy. Most wizards and witches are here before attending an institution like Hogwarts. Aurelian watched in silence. It was information he had not seen in such detail even in the books he had read. The second rank, Conjurer, is the most common among adult wizards. It represents the ability to cast formal spells, create basic enchantments, and defend oneself with some ease. I would say that more than 70% of the world's magical population will never exceed this rank. Cedric raised an eyebrow in surprise. Roll continued, "Why, you ask?" "Because this is where most people stop. Out of convenience. Out of fear. Out of ignorance." His eyes scanned each of the students. "The barrier between conjurer and invoker is not magical, it is mental and spiritual." "Spiritual," whispered a Hufflepuff girl in the back. "Yes," Roll nodded without turning around. "To become an invoker, the third rank, skill alone is not enough. It requires deep understanding, discipline, and a conscious relationship with your own source of power. It involves summoning magic from within and controlling it from without, creating and manipulating complex spells, artifacts, entities, and forces with your will. The room was completely silent. Only the echo of his voice floated in the air. "And the archmages?" asked a Slytherin student. Roll's eyes hardened for a moment. Then, with a gesture, he made the floating words disappear and conjured a single image, a large, ancient arcane symbol floating above the blackboard. "The rank of archmage is so rare throughout the world that there are currently only 7 living archmages. One of them is your headmaster, Albus Dumbledore." A murmur ran through the classroom. Archmages don't just cast spells. They create new magical paths. They alter the structure of spells, bend the laws of nature, and become one with the currents of magic itself. They can live for centuries. In some cases, more than 200 years without losing their lucidity. Aurelian barely moved. His face was a mask of concentration. "And finally, there is the 5th and final rank," Roll lowered his voice, "the sage. Throughout recorded history, fewer than 10 individuals have reached this level. Many believe that sages no longer exist, or that they have hidden themselves behind the veils of the world." The classroom fell into reverent silence. A sage does not merely understand magic. He is magic. His mere presence alters the environment. With a single thought, he can summon a storm or silence a city. But that power comes at a cost, one that very few are willing to pay. Roll walked to his desk and rested his hands on it, looking at everyone. "Most of you will never advance beyond conjurer. Not because you can't, but because the world has taught you to fear the unknown. If you want more, you must desire it with all your being, and above all, you must be willing to lose things along the way." No one dared to reply. Aurelian lowered his gaze for a moment. Invoker. Archmage. Sage. He had a long way to go. But he was more than determined to pass each level. He stood behind his desk for a few more seconds, staring at the students. Then he raised a hand, fingers spread. "Many wonder, how do you know when you've crossed a magical threshold?" His voice resonated as if coming from somewhere deeper than his throat. "You'll know, because everything changes." He walked slowly back in front of the desks, continuing to speak. "When you go from initiate to conjurer, it feels as if the world suddenly responds. Spells become precise, obedient. Magic ceases to be an accident and becomes a tool." He paused briefly. "But when you become an invoker," his voice grew deeper, "it's different. It feels as if something inside you awakens. As if you were a channel for something greater. The air vibrates differently around you. Magical creatures sense you. The world hears you." The students were so attentive that they barely breathed. "In case you were wondering," he added with a barely visible half-smile, "I am an invoker." Then he spread both hands out to the sides. In an instant, the pressure in the classroom changed. A chill ran through everyone present. The air became denser, charged. The feathers and scrolls vibrated slightly. Even the walls seemed to whisper. Aurelian narrowed his eyes, sensing that subtle but imposing expansion of energy. It was not a spell being cast, it was pure presence. Manifest magical authority. Cedric swallowed and shrank a little in his seat. Other students looked around restlessly. "What you are feeling is the minimal manifestation of a summoner's mastery," Roll said calmly. "I do not cast spells, I do not impose my will. I am simply present. And the magic responds." The air returned to normal with a slight crackle. "Now imagine," said the professor, sitting back down, "what it would be like to be in the presence of an archmage." No one said anything. "The reason I teach you this is simple," he added harshly. "If you don't understand how vast the path of a magician is, you will remain stuck. Like millions of wizards around the world." He leaned forward. "But if you understand it, and desire it, perhaps one or two of you will go further than all those who came before you." Luke and Roll watched silently as the students continued to digest what they had just experienced. Some were still tense, others simply amazed. Then he stood up straight once more and raised his voice, firm but calm, "Before you leave, there is something else you must understand." The classroom fell completely silent. "Saying that I am an invoker does not mean that all invokers are the same," he paused. "Rank does not determine a mage's total power, only the threshold they have managed to cross. Some can barely summon their magic beyond their bodies. Others could move mountains if they wanted to." His eyes scanned the class. "The same applies to each level. There are conjurers who could defeat inexperienced invokers and archmages who are nothing more than glorified politicians." He let his words sink in. "Real power is not given by title. You forge it yourselves." An invisible bell rang in the distance, marking the end of class. "That's all for today. You may leave." The students rose silently, processing every word. Some left faster, others slower, but they all knew that this class had been different. Aurelian was one of the last to leave the classroom, silently. The professor's words echoed in his mind. Not all summoners were the same, and the path to the top, even with talent, would be steeper than he imagined. The great hall was filled with the constant murmur of plates, cutlery, and conversation. Floating candles flickered above the long tables, casting soft light on the students' faces. Aurelian ate silently at his usual place at the Slytherin table, his thoughts wandering. Professor Roll's voice still echoed in his mind. "Real power is not given by title. You forge it yourselves." Aurelian looked down at his glass of pumpkin juice, where the shimmering reflection of the lights watched him silently. He knew it. He was already a conjurer. He had felt it months ago, when his magic ceased to depend on forced gestures or overflowing emotion and began to flow as a natural extension of his will. He knew it every time he trained to the limit. Every time he created something new. Every time his magic responded without hesitation. But no one else knew, and that was for the best. He calmly took a spoonful of meat pie into his mouth, while around him the voices of other students filled the space with laughter and gossip. He had time. Plans. The title didn't define him, but it was a step along the way. And Aurelian Gaunt intended to cross that path completely. Chapter 21. Chapter 21. Whispers. Winter was slowly approaching over the Hogwarts grounds, tinting the sky grey and covering the edges of the Black Lake with a thin layer of frost. In the castle, routines had already settled in, classes continued their course, the corridors vibrated with the bustle of students, and the floating candles in the great dining hall seemed lower and warmer, as if seeking to resist the cold. Aurelian walked the corridors as quietly as ever. He had learned to move between classes without attracting too much attention, to appear just where he needed to be and disappear when it was no longer useful to be present. But in the last few weeks, he had begun to notice something strange. It wasn't footsteps. Not whispers. Not even obvious glances. It was a feeling. Sometimes around a corner. Others, while going over his homework in the library. Once, even, while practicing alone by the greenhouse. A light sensation, like a brush against the back of his neck. As if someone was watching him from afar. It was constant. Persistent. Undeniable. Aurelian ignored it most of the time. He pretended not to notice. But his eyes always swept the environment. He learned to enter classrooms by looking at the reflections in the windows, to use picture frames as mirrors. Always in silence. Always calmly. The most curious thing of all was that despite the silence, that look, it seemed somewhat familiar. Somehow, it provoked an unsettling warmth in him. As if, where others saw a strange and quiet child, that gaze saw something else. The faculty meeting room, located in one of the highest towers of the castle, was illuminated by the warm light of the floating lamps that danced softly on the oak table. There, the Hogwarts professors had gathered for the semesterly evaluation of their students. Dumbledore, at the head, in his dark blue robes decorated with silver tones, raised his wand slightly to indicate that the meeting would begin. "My dear colleagues," he said serenely, enough time has passed since the term began. I would like you to share your observations about our new students. This year seems to be promising. McGonagall was the first to speak. Cedric Diggory, of Hufflepuff, has shown maturity and level-headedness unusual for a first-year student. In Transfiguration he is progressing remarkably quickly, is respectful and cooperative. Not only does he follow the rules, he also gains the trust of his peers with ease. Yes, added Professor Sprout, with a proud smile. In herbology he has a special sensitivity. His patience is an example. I assure you great things. Professor Sinistra looked up from her parchments and added, Moira Selwyn of Ravenclaw has also excelled. She is meticulous, curious, and seems to have an innate affinity for the skies. She is the first to turn in her star charts, without error. The Weasley twins, commented Professor Hooch, with a mixture of resignation and amusement. Fred and George, they have caused more than one startle, but they are talented. In flight, they have impressive instincts. With the right discipline, they could become excellent Quidditch players, or dangerous pranksters. There was restrained laughter around the table. It was then that Dumbledore gently turned his gaze to the other end of the table. Professor Roll, any observations from your class? Lucan Roll, dark-haired and piercing-eyed, his charcoal grey robe adorned with a metallic brooch in the shape of a dragon's fang, nodded slowly. His voice was deep, controlled, as if he always measured what he said. There are many promising students, but there is one who stands out for very different reasons. Aurelian Gaunt. A few teachers looked up. The name still caused subtle reactions. His ability for tactical analysis is remarkable. He not only understands the fundamentals, he anticipates them. He never repeats a mistake, and most importantly, he shows no fear. Not even when we simulate tense situations. He is eerily serene. How does he behave with his peers? Asked McGonagall. Roll leaned back slightly. Curious. You don't see him bonding with too many. But I've noticed he maintains a close relationship with Cedric Diggory. They talk often. They even train together when they have free time. I've also seen him sharing comments with Fred and George Weasley, which could be dangerous, he added with a slight smile. Do you consider him friends? Inquired Flitwick. Yes, though the Weasleys, let's just say they respect him. In their own way. He seems to choose who he hangs out with. Never out of obligation. Never out of interest. Snape, who until then had remained silent, spoke in a low but clear voice. Gaunt is peculiar. He has advanced magical control, discreet but firm. He knows more than he should, though he hides it well. I have observed him. In potions, he is disciplined, though he avoids standing out more than necessary. Do you think he is pretending not to know? Asked Sprout, surprised. Snape did not immediately respond. I think he's careful. As if he knows we're all watching him. Has he caused trouble? Insisted Hooch. None, added McGonagall. He is impeccable in conduct, yet there is something about the way he acts, not arrogance, but something that sets him apart from the rest. Interesting, muttered Dumbledore, thoughtfully. Sometimes, the real complexity is in what is left unsaid. The conversation continued for a few more minutes. Students from other houses, curricular adjustments, and future evaluations were discussed. But when Dumbledore closed the meeting, his mind kept going over a single word: Aurelian. The wind blew gently through the branches near the Black Lake. Aurelian, who had grown accustomed to taking shelter there in the afternoons, walked with his hands in his pockets and his mind scattered. Hogwarts was still a place full of secrets, but the outside offered him something that the corridors did not: air, space, silence. He was about to sit down near a rock when he heard a voice. "And what are you guys doing here alone?" said a voice laden with mockery. He turned her face slightly. Near the edge of the lake, 3 older students, all Slytherin by their badges, had surrounded 2 girls. The girls' robes billowed in the wind, and though Aurelian could only see their backs, it didn't take much to recognize them. Their posture was rigid, their wands still unraised. They didn't look frightened, but they didn't react either. They were like statues, frozen with a mixture of wounded pride and something deeper, distrust. One of the elders raised his wand. "Come on, move a bit. Tarant Legra. Expelliarmus." The wand flew before the spell was complete. Everyone turned around, startled. Aurelian walked calmly towards them, unhurried, unafraid. 3 against 2. His voice sounded calm, almost polite. "Does that make them feel powerful?" "What's it to you, Gaunt?" the older man growled. Aurelian didn't respond. He raised his hand gracefully and uttered a protego to intercept a treacherously thrown rictus empra. Then with precision, he disarmed the other 2 swiftly. They were no match. "Enough. Go back the way you came." The 3 retreated angrily, knowing they had lost. One of them spat on the ground before walking away, muttering insults and empty promises. Aurelian barely looked at them. Aurelian turned to the girls. This time he could see them clearly. Their faces were identical, though not quite. Hestia had an expression of steely concentration, Flora eyes of wonder so pure they almost seemed to glow. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone soft. The twins looked at him as if they saw something no one else could see. "A savior, perhaps. A beacon." "We are," said Hestia, firm. "Thank you," Aurelian added Flora, with a particular warmth. "You already knew my name," he was surprised. "For some time now," replied Hestia with unsettling honesty. There was a brief silence before Flora took a small step forward. With a slight impromptu bow, she said, "Flora Caro." "Hestia Caro," her sister added, retorting the gesture gracefully. Aurelian sketched a faint smile. He removed a pair of magical sweets from his pocket and offered them to her. "A gift for the scares. Be sure to use them wisely," he joked. The girls reached out their hands at the same time, briefly brushing Aurelian's fingers as they took the candy. "We'll make sure of it," they said almost in unison, as if they were one voice. Aurelian, satisfied with the exchange, said goodbye with a quiet gesture and began to walk away down the path without turning back. But if he had, he would have seen how Hestia and Flora watched him in complete silence. How a faint smile that was beginning to peek out of her lips, and how in her eyes, there was no longer fear or surprise, only a silent, unbreakable desire. Something dark, haunting, sweet, devotion. "He hasn't forgotten us," whispered one of them. "And he never will," said the other. The dim light of the enchanted lamps fell softly on the library shelves. Aurelian, sitting in a little travelled corner, was slowly turning the pages of a dusty tome on concealment incantations. Silence reigned, interrupted only by the soft rustling of leaves and the rustle of a quill taking notes. He was concentrating, but not so much on noticing how he was being watched. He looked up slightly without looking up at all. 2 figures were approaching. "Good afternoon, Aurelian," they said in sync, in a voice that seemed almost rehearsed. Hestia and Flora. They were carrying books in their arms, but from the way they walked, Aurelian suspected they weren't reading. They were looking for him. "Good afternoon," he replied with a slight smile, closing his book gracefully. The twins took a seat across from him, moving with the calmness of those who already knew they would be welcome, even if they had never been given permission. "What are you reading?" asked Flora, tilting her head slightly, like a curious cat. "Techniques of magical concealment. Nothing fun." "Sounds useful," said Hestia with a slight smile, "though we don't think you need to hide from anyone." Aurelian held both of their gazes for a second. It was as if they were speaking with ulterior motives, a statement, some warning. "Sometimes even he who has no enemies must know how not to be seen," he replied subtly. Flora pulled a small thin object out of her robe and laid it on the table. It was a handmade bookmark. "We made it ourselves," she said, not giving it any thought. "It has some basic protections. We thought you might need it." Aurelian took it gently. "Thank you. You didn't have to." "We know," they said at the same time. For a few seconds, they could only hear pages turning and a quill writing. Then, Hestia spoke in a casual tone. "If you need anything at all, you can look us up." "Yes," whispered Flora, "we're always close by." Aurelian nodded diplomatically, but his mind had already taken note of the pattern. Too many coincidences. Too much precision. He watched as the twins got up with their books and walked away together, talking to each other in such low tones that not even the library itself could hear them. Aurelian returned to his reading. Although she wasn't reading with the same concentration, the bookmark was still on the table, laden with a meaning he still didn't quite decipher. "They'll always be around," he thought wryly. Chapter 22. Chapter 22. Friends. Snow began to fall steadily in the last days of December, blanketing the grounds of Hogwarts in white and freezing the edges of the lake like a half-formed mirror. Aurelian watched from one of the highest windows in a tower, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the carriages and students leave for Hogsmeade, bound for their family vacations. Cedric was one of the first to seek him out to say goodbye. "Are you sure you don't want to come with us?" he asked with a warm smile, his gloves half on and a scarf hanging from his neck. "Mom makes a spectacular chicken." Aurelian shook his head calmly. "I could use a little peace and quiet. I want to take advantage of the opportunity to study a few things and explore the castle when there aren't so many people around. Besides, I don't like to break with family traditions." Cedric looked at him silently for a second, as if he wanted to say something else, but he just nodded. "All right. But I'll send you something by owl," he assured him. Shortly after, the Weasley twins appeared, each carrying a suitcase that seemed to have a life of its own. Fred was carrying a box of Bertie Bott's every flavor beans, and George was dragging a Gryffindor scarf as if it had been given to him reluctantly. "Are you going to miss us, oh great mysterious Slytherin?" Fred joked with feigned drama. "Terribly," Aurelian joked with a subtle smile. "The castle without you will be quiet." "What a strange compliment." George laughed. "Well, save some of that calm for next term. If anyone bothers you, remind them that you have friends in Gryffindor. We won't tell them we're mischievous, yet." Aurelian nodded, truly grateful, even though his words were always more restrained. "Thanks, Fred." "George. Take care at home." "You too, Snake Lord," they said in unison, giving him a nickname that made them laugh. He watched them walk away laughing, and for a moment, he felt a strange warmth in his chest. Hogwarts, unpredictable as it was giving him things he had never had before, real connections. Friends. Now, with the hallways emptier than ever, the castle would be his for a few weeks. His time. His silence. His world. The following days passed slowly and quietly. Without the constant bustle of hundreds of students, Hogwarts became a more intimate, ancient place. The stairs seemed less capricious, the paintings more willing to converse, and the sound of footsteps became a comforting whisper. Aurelian explored every corner. He strolled calmly through the torch-lit corridors, discovering forgotten portraits, dusty statues, and corridors that only seemed to reveal themselves when the castle was silent. Occasionally, he practiced minor spells in the empty halls, adjusting his gestures, refining his magical intent with precision. One afternoon, as he curiously examined an enchanted display case in the hallway, he heard a cheerful voice beside him. "Ah, Mr. Gaunt. Do you also find this collection fascinating?" It was Professor Flitwick, dressed in a Christmas-colored robe that slowly changed color. The little charms teacher had a special sparkle in his eyes when it came to magical curiosities. "Yes, Professor. I was wondering why some of these display cases are enchanted to open only with certain names." Flitwick smiled proudly. "A blood charm, one of the oldest. Although Hogwarts does not usually use such filters, these artifacts were donated by families very jealous of their history. Some even respond only if the person who touches them has a lineage that goes back to their creators." Aurelian listened attentively. There was something comforting about the professor's way of explaining things, as if each word were part of a symphony of knowledge. I suppose there are many things here that we still don't fully understand, Aurelian commented, letting his hand brush against the glass without expecting a response. That's why we keep learning. Flitwick exclaimed cheerfully. Never underestimate what a forgotten object can teach you, Mr. Gaunt. Sometimes, those objects contain truths more enduring than books. After bowing goodbye, Flitwick disappeared down another corridor, leaving him alone with his thoughts once more. It was that same night, while dining alone in the great hall adorned with floating candles, mistletoe branches, and charming decorations, that he noticed two other figures sharing his solitude. Hestia and Flora. The twins, as if connected by an invisible thread, sat down at the same table, one on either side of Aurelian, without asking. Their faces reflected surprise, curiosity, perhaps something more. Something that Aurelian, even with his keen perception, could not quite decipher. "We didn't know you were staying for the holidays too," said Flora, in a soft voice with a peculiar accent, as if each word were carefully measured. "Most people don't," Aurelian replied calmly, looking at both of them. "But I suppose those of us who stay, share certain things." "Things like what?" asked Hestia, her tone slightly higher, though just as calm. "Cargo, I suppose," he replied without thinking too much about it. Then he added, "Do they always sit like that, on either side of someone?" The two looked at each other and smiled, identically. "Only with you." Aurelian tilted his head. There was no judgment in his gaze, but there was a spark of suspicion. Still, he said nothing more. They ate dinner in silence, and it was Flora who carefully placed a small twig wrapped in an illusionary snow spell in front of him. "Merry Christmas in advance, Aurelian," she said with a barely perceptible smile. The young Gaunt looked at her for a few seconds. Then, with a serene gesture, he took the twig and tucked it inside his tunic. "Thank you," he replied, allowing himself something unusual for him, a sincere smile. Snow continued to fall on the grounds of Hogwarts like a persistent but silent spell. The mornings were cold, but the warmth in the castle corridors was enough to keep Aurelian from feeling the need to return to the mansion, even for a second. Especially when his days were being shared with such peculiar company. The Caro twins, Hestia and Flora, had become a constant part of his routine. Although at first their appearances were sporadic, shrouded in a halo of mystery that they seemed to project naturally, as the days passed they began to show themselves to be more open, almost normal, at least as normal as two girls who spoke in sync, walked with identical steps, and had a tendency to appear just when Aurelian thought he was alone could seem. But it didn't bother him. In fact, he enjoyed their company. They spent their afternoons in the library, walking through the most forgotten corridors of the castle. On one occasion, they found an abandoned room with a broken mirror that reflected distorted images back at them. They spent hours laughing among reflections of worlds that did not exist. During one of those walks through the snowy corridors of the first floor, Hestia asked him, "Do you like being alone, Aurelian?" He looked at her calmly and then looked at Flora, who was waiting for the answer with an attentive gaze. "I like to have control over the space I inhabit. But that doesn't mean I mind sharing it, with the right people." The twins exchanged a quick glance, and for a moment Aurelian felt that strange intensity in their eyes again. As if he had said exactly what they wanted to hear. Christmas Day arrived shrouded in a soft mist that covered the gardens. The great hall had been completely transformed, magical trees decorated with floating orbs, Christmas elves, and musical enchantments filled the atmosphere with festive warmth. The tables were overflowing with food, juicy turkeys, steaming cakes, gingerbread cookies that danced on their own before anyone ate them, and bowls of hot chocolate floating between the tables. Aurelian sat next to the twins, Flora on his right and Hestia on his left. Although the dining hall was not even half full, the atmosphere was cozy. Flitwick flew above the tables decorating them with bright lights, while Professor Sprout enchanted the cutlery so that it served food automatically. After the banquet, the students who remained at Hogwarts went up to their common rooms or gathered in empty halls to open gifts and share moments together. Aurelian settled down by the fire in the common room with a book in his hands, and soon a small box wrapped in red paper floated toward him. He took it with a raised eyebrow. It had clumsy but enthusiastic handwriting, "Merry Christmas, Aurelian." Fred and George. When he opened it, he found a small mechanical device that exploded in a small burst of snow and released a hand-knitted green and silver scarf. It had a not-so-subtle gold border. "Perfect," he murmured with an amused smile. Another package, this one smaller and more elegant, appeared with a faint jingle. It was from Cedric. It contained an enchanted quill and a note: "I promised you that not all Hufflepuffs are predictable. See you soon, friend." The twins didn't give him anything openly, but when he returned to his dormitory that night, he found a black box with no signature carefully placed on his bed. Inside was a collection of pages from old books with spells for tracking, magical concealment, and stealth. Some were extremely advanced. A single thought crossed his mind. They knew. They knew exactly what would interest me. Aurelian lay staring at the ceiling for a few minutes before going to sleep. For the first time in a long time, he felt that his surroundings not only accepted him, but that he was beginning to be part of something. The Hogwarts Express released a cloud of steam as it pulled into Hogsmeade Station. The sky was clear and the air was freezing, but the excitement of the students as they got off the train warmed the scene. Carrying heavy trunks and cages filled with squeaking pets, the students began to file toward the enchanted carriages. Aurelian watched from the edge of the path, wrapped in his winter cloak. His eyes scanned the bustle, alert to certain familiar voices. "Aurelian," a cheerful voice called out from the crowd. Cedric Diggory pushed his way through a group of third-year students, his stride confident and his characteristic open smile on his face. Right behind him, Fred and George Weasley appeared, carrying a trunk between them, although it was clear that one of them was letting the other do most of the work. "Did you survive without us?" Fred joked, raising an eyebrow. "The castle was quiet," Aurelian replied with a slight smile. "Silent, even." George stepped forward, pulling a poorly wrapped package from his robe. "You missed our latest creation. Too bad. We almost blew up an entire boiler in Mom's kitchen." "We still think it was a resounding success," Fred added solemnly. Cedric shook his head, amused. "And what did you do?" he asked as they walked toward the castle. "Did you discover another secret room or tame a dragon during the holidays?" Cedric joked. Aurelian shook his head slightly. "Nothing that spectacular. But I've been busy, learning and making friends." At that moment, two female figures approached calmly from the carriage area. The Caro twins, wrapped in perfectly buttoned green cloaks, walked elegantly. Their eyes immediately sought out Aurelian. "Hestia, Flora," said Aurelian, pausing to wait for them. "I'd like to introduce you to some friends of mine." The two curtsied almost in unison, their eyes subtly scanning the new arrivals. "A pleasure," they said in unison. Cedric and the twins fell silent for a moment, somewhat surprised by the sisters' synchrony, although George soon broke the ice with a playful smile. "What an elegant introduction! Do all Slytherins greet each other like that, or is it a special treatment for Aurelian?" "Only for those he considers important," replied Hestia, without taking her eyes off Aurelian. Aurelian raised an eyebrow. They resumed their march toward the castle, now as a larger group. Hogwarts awaited, enveloped in snow and magic. Chapter 23, Chapter 23 Appearances and Bonds. The routine at Hogwarts might seem the same to some: classes, homework, meals in the Great Hall, and occasional escapades through the castle's enchanted corridors. But for Aurelian, each day had a different texture, a new nuance that kept him alert. Winter had slowly given way to the end of January, as the ice began to melt from the gargoyles on the roof, and Aurelian had found his own rhythm at school. The classes, though mostly easy for him, continued to offer opportunities to observe, measure, and learn. He excelled without effort, though he never sought attention. Whether in charms with Professor Flitwick, where he cast spells with a precision that surprised even those in higher grades, or in potions, where Snape himself would reluctantly utter a faint, expressionless acceptable, Aurelian moved with calm. What had begun to attract the most attention, however, was not his talent. It was his companions. Since returning from the Christmas holidays, the twins seemed to have attached themselves to him like an extension of his own shadow. They sat next to him in theory classes, waited for him outside the Great Hall, and even shared some of their free time with him in the library or the quiet corridors of the Astronomy Tower. They were not intrusive, at least not in the eyes of others. Their presence was constant. They seemed to know exactly when to speak and when to remain silent, and although they rarely addressed anyone other than Aurelian with much enthusiasm, their behavior was not strange enough to raise any real alarm. But the teachers noticed. Professor McGonagall had mentioned in the staff room that the Caro sisters seem obsessed with Aurelian, while Lucan Roll, the defense against the dark arts teacher, simply observed the situation with calculating eyes from the back of each class. Even Flitwick, somewhere between curious and a little cautious, asked Aurelian a couple of questions about it, to which he responded neutrally. The students also whispered from time to time. Some with poorly concealed envy, others with simple intrigue. It was hard not to notice that wherever Aurelian went, they went too. The Caros, with their peculiar synchronicity, did not invade his personal space or demand his attention. But they did offer him constant, silent company, as if they could read his moods without the need for words. Aurelian, though reserved, had learned to recognize their usefulness. They kept people with hidden intentions or trivial interests at bay. Without saying so, the twins had become a social shield that he valued more than he let on. One morning, as they walked together to herbology class in the greenhouses, Hestia offered him a small jar. "To help you sleep," she said in a neutral voice, whispering, "I've noticed you've been more tense this week." Aurelian didn't respond immediately. He took the bottle and tucked it into his robe with a brief nod. Flora, on his other side, said nothing. She just looked at him a second longer than usual, her eyes seeming too fixed, too attentive. He said nothing, but he thought about it. As the weeks went by, Aurelian began to enjoy the company of his friends more, especially Cedric and the Weasley twins. They were a strange group, if you thought about it logically. Cedric, always kind and noble in his view of the world, Fred and George, loud, brilliant in their own way, and eternally inclined toward the chaos of their pranks. Then there was him, Aurelian, quiet, calculating, thoughtful, someone who didn't seek to fit in, and yet he had found a small circle to which he belonged. When they gathered in the library to study or, in the Weasleys' case, to do something that resembled studying, the Caro twins usually sat at the same table, often watching Aurelian in silence. They responded politely to greetings from Cedric and the Weasleys, though their tone always seemed too cold by the other students' standards. "Wow," Fred commented one day, leafing through a potions book upside down, "Aurelian's silent bodyguards are efficient. If anyone approaches with bad intentions, they're sure to end up petrified." "Petrified?" George laughed. "Won't they be poisoned?" The twins didn't even blink. Hestia simply observed them as if evaluating an interesting insect. Flora, for her part, glanced at Aurelian with a small, barely visible smile. Already accustomed to the subtle threats and surveillance they exerted over their surroundings, he simply nodded. "Don't mess with them," Aurelian said calmly, without looking up from the book he was reading. "They're smarter than they look." Cedric let out a stifled laugh. "That was clear to me from the moment I saw them cast that double spell in charms. Not even Fred and George could coordinate like that, and they're twins." "Hey," they protested in unison. "The interactions were always like that, natural, and although the Caros did not make an effort to integrate into the group, their presence was always constant. Hestia would sometimes hand Aurelian a new bottle of ink without saying a word. Flora would slide pieces of parchment with organized notes toward him when she saw him concentrating on some research. Neither was particularly effusive, but both began to show gestures that in other contexts might be considered affectionate. They never competed with each other. On the contrary, it seemed that they had decided to share the space Aurelian devoted to them, without ever forcing his attention, but making it clear that they were not invisible to his eyes. One afternoon, during a walk with Cedric through the corridors after an enchantment class, the boy commented, "You know, it's strange, but I think they trust you in a very intense way. The Caros, I mean. I don't know if you've noticed how they look at you," he said. Aurelian had noticed. "For some time now. I think they have a purpose," he replied. "They've always been like that with me." Cedric nodded slowly. It was one of the things he liked most about Aurelian. He didn't judge, he didn't ask more questions than necessary. He just observed, accepted, and kept walking. In the days that followed, the twins began to change in small ways as well. Hestia called him by his name more often, in a soft, quiet voice. Flora sometimes stopped to wait for him, even if he was talking to Cedric or the twins. If before their gazes had been fixed and restrained, now they showed something warmer, though difficult to read for anyone who didn't know what their smiles hid. Aurelian said nothing. He did not reject them. Something inside him urged caution. It was a connection that was not entirely normal, but it was genuine. As the final weeks of the school year approached, Aurelian spent more time alone. Not because he lacked company, the twins were always nearby, and his friends sought him out frequently, but because he felt the need to think. From a high window in a tower of the castle, with night enveloping him and the stars marking his course, Aurelian let his thoughts flow. It had been a strange year. "I have achieved more than I ever imagined in such a short time," he told himself, watching the moon slip between the clouds. "My magic has been refined. My spells are more stable, my occlumency deeper." He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cool wind caress his face. It was comforting, real, yet he couldn't help but remember. In his other life, things had been different. Not necessarily worse, but more simple. In this world, however, every step he took opened up infinite possibilities. His theories multiplied, his limits expanded. He was no longer just a child with memories of another life. He was someone with a purpose. "I've made friends," he thought with some surprise. Cedric, kind and talkative. The twins, with their indomitable energy, and the Caros, they're another story. More complex. More delicate. In his memories, the image of Flora holding a book silently as she waited for him to finish a page, or Hestia correcting a mistake in potions with a slight gesture, overlapped with the warm feeling of having been accepted. His emotions may be strange, but they are real. As real as mine. Aurelian opened his eyes slowly. "When this year is over," he murmured softly, "I will return to Gaunt Manor. I will plan Gaunt Corp's next moves with Krivix and resume the workshop in Godric's Hollow. In addition to continuing my training." Because Aurelian wasn't fooling himself. The world was changing. He could feel it in the whispers of magic. And he would have to be prepared. Hogwarts was only the first step. With a sigh, he got up and quietly went downstairs, leaving the night behind to return to his dormitory. The great hall glowed with a festive atmosphere. The floating candles gave off a warmer light than usual, as if sharing the students' joy at the end of the school year. The tables were laden with dishes and sweets, while conversations filled the air with a mixture of excitement, nostalgia, and relief. Aurelian sat elegantly at the Slytherin table, dressed in his house robe. To his right, Hestia wore a faint smile, her hand resting casually on the table, close to his. To his left, Flora rested her chin on one hand, her eyes calmly fixed on Aurelian, as if just looking at him made her know that the world was all right. There was something about their closeness, a silent connection, that others were beginning to notice, though no one dared to comment. From his table, Cedric sent him a friendly smile, which Aurelian returned with a brief nod. The Weasley twins also greeted him, raising their glasses with a teasing smile. The metallic sound of a spoon tapping against a glass rang out. On the central podium, Albus Dumbledore, in his elegant midnight blue robe and relaxed expression, stood up. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his warm voice seeming to fill every corner of the hall. "We have reached the end of another year at Hogwarts. A year of new beginnings, challenges overcome, and, of course, unexpected mischief." There was some laughter from the Gryffindor table, where Fred and George pretended not to know who the headmaster was referring to. "This school year has been full of memorable moments. We have seen friendships blossom, unique talents emerge, and our houses grow stronger. But as every year..." He paused with a smile, "it is time to announce the winner of the House Cup." The silence was palpable. With a total of... Dumbledore pulled a small card from inside his robe. 492 points, the house that wins this year is... Another pause. "Slytherin," he shouted joyfully. The ceiling of the Great Hall changed immediately, covered in emerald green and silver colors, the serpent emblem waving majestically above them. The Slytherin students burst into cheers. Some rose from their seats, others hugged each other, glasses clinking one after another. Aurelian, however, did not applaud or cheer. He simply watched the celebration with a slight smile, while Hestia and Flora leaned subtly toward him. "Good job," whispered Flora. "It's been a brilliant year," added Hestia sweetly. Aurelian accepted the words with a small nod and a smile. Dumbledore raised his cup. "To Slytherin. And to all the students, for another year in this castle full of history, magic, and possibilities," he said, glancing briefly at the green table. The glasses were raised in a general toast. The banquet began with enchanted dishes and sparkling desserts. Aurelian ate. His mind already racing, he planned for the coming year, and what would come after. Chapter 24, Chapter 24 Obsession. Hogsmeade Station was shrouded in a light mist that slowly dissipated under the June sun. Hogwarts students walked among the bustle of the platform, dragging trunks, accompanied by pets in cages or restless owls flapping their wings. The Hogwarts Express waited with its doors open, emitting soft clouds of steam that whistled rhythmically. The train, bright red with gold details, looked almost like a living creature, ready to devour the student's last breath and take with it the stories that had taken place within its walls. Aurelian walked calmly along the platform, observing the faces of his first-year classmates. Cedric said goodbye to some boys from his house with a smile. Fred and George Weasley, meanwhile, were already sitting on a bench next to Lee Jordan, laughing as they discussed a list of great moments of the year. When Cedric saw Aurelian, he approached him with his usual serenity. "Hey," he said, adjusting his trunk. "Looks like I'll be seeing you in London. I thought, well, maybe you'd prefer to be accompanied by your friends," he said with a diplomatic smile, glancing quickly at the two girls standing next to Aurelian. Hestia and Flora were standing next to him as always. Their Slytherin robes fluttered in the breeze, both wearing serene expressions. Hestia kept her hands folded in her lap, while Flora twirled her wand slightly between her fingers. "Yes," Aurelian replied in a friendly tone, "we'll chat later on the train." Cedric nodded. He said no more. The way the twins looked at him, making no effort to hide their displeasure at his interruption, was enough to make it clear that they didn't want him there. As Aurelian and the Carrows boarded the train, Fred called out from the bench, "Remember to bring us ideas for more mischief, Aurelian. This summer we have to plan the next great Hogwarts legend." Aurelian allowed himself a slight smile and raised his hand in farewell. As he boarded the train, he felt Hestia and Flora's eyes immediately fix on him. It was as if they were not only escorting him, but marking their territory with every step. "First or last car?" he asked, breaking the silence. "One far away," said Flora in a soft voice, "where no one will disturb us. Where we can be at peace," added Hestia, "with you." Aurelian nodded and let them guide him. They found an empty compartment near the back of the train, with the curtains drawn and a peaceful atmosphere created by the sun shining through the window. Aurelian placed his trunk on the overhead rack and sank into the seat by the window. The twins sat directly across from him. The train's wheels creaked under the rails, marking the slow pace of the school year's farewell. Inside the compartment, the evening light tinged the curtains with gold and bathed the faces of the three occupants. Aurelian gazed out the window in silence, lost in thought, while Hestia and Flora watched him with a devotion they barely tried to hide. Their eyes followed him, as if every word he uttered deserved to be memorized. "When you saved us in the alley." Flora broke the silence, her voice soft, "No one else would have done that for us. No one saw us the way you did." "It was nothing," Aurelian replied, without taking his eyes off the landscape. "It was the right thing to do." "For you, maybe," said Hestia, leaning slightly toward him. "For us, it was everything." Aurelian slowly turned his head, his grey eyes meeting those of the twins. For a moment, he thought of saying something evasive, something neutral. But he understood that the Caros were no ordinary girls. There was loneliness in them. Silent wounds they had learned to hide behind soft smiles and intense gazes. "No one should feel lonely," he finally said, his tone warmer. "As long as I'm around, I won't let anyone hurt you." As soon as he finished speaking, a spark seemed to ignite between the twins. Hestia straightened up and her pupils shone with a deep intensity, as if an oath had been sealed at that moment. Flora clasped her hands in her lap, but her fingers trembled slightly, as if she were holding something precious. Her smile, once discreet, became more possessive. "Do you promise?" Hestia asked, her voice barely a whisper, but full of emotion. "I promise," Aurelian assured them. The two nodded at the same time. They were no longer just grateful girls. That moment had changed them. Something had taken root in their hearts in a profound way. "Then, never leave us," Flora said innocently, though her eyes screamed otherwise. "Because we won't let you go." Aurelian felt a slight chill. He had spoken those words sincerely, but now he understood that for them, it was much more than just a phrase. It wasn't gratitude. It was something else. He looked out the window again. The sky was darkening. Summer was coming. The next school year was still far away. But he knew that from now on, two presences would always walk beside him, or behind him. The constant rattling of the Hogwarts Express filled the compartment with a murmur. Aurelian slept peacefully by the window, his serene face bathed in the golden light of the sunset filtering through the glass. One of his hands rested on his lap and the other hung slightly from the seat. Hestia watched him with a calmness that hid a flood of emotions. Every detail of his face, his long eyelashes, the slight movement of his chest as he breathed, the corners of his relaxed lips was a reminder to her of the promise he had made to them before. "As long as I'm around, I won't let anyone hurt you," she thought. Those words had not been lost in the noise of the carriage or the bustle of the corridors. No, those words had sunk like roots into her soul. Hestia could feel them engraved on her chest, like a burning mark. An oath. A bond. "You heard him, didn't you?" she whispered, without taking her eyes off Aurelian. Flora, sitting across from her, nodded very slowly, as if the slightest movement might break the moment. "He said it, from the heart," she murmured. Her fingers fiddled with the edge of her tunic, her gaze also fixed on the sleeping boy. "No one had ever spoken to us like that. Never. At least not truly. Not parents, not teachers, not anyone," Hestia continued with a hint of tenderness she rarely showed. Her voice grew warmer. He saw us. Not like others see us. Not as just another pair of carrows. He looked at us as if we were important to him. And we are, aren't we? Flora asked in a whisper, unsure for just a moment. Hestia took her hand firmly. We are, and if we're not, we will be, she promised. Both fell silent for a few seconds, simply gazing at the boy sleeping peacefully in front of them. Aurelian Gaunt, with a sharp mind and hidden power, but to them he was their hero. I want to protect him too, Flora said suddenly, lowering her voice even more. I don't just want to be protected. Me too. Hestia squeezed her sister's hand gently. To be his allies, his refuge. The only ones, in his life. The train continued on its way, unperturbed. But in that compartment, something had changed forever. The twins no longer saw Aurelian as just their savior. Now they saw him as someone who had given them a reason to live in this world. A reason to feel. To love. In their minds, the love that was growing for him was not fleeting or weak. It was absolute. Silent for now, but as deep as the roots of the forbidden forest. We won't let anyone else have it, said Flora, almost without realizing she was saying it out loud. Never, said Hestia with a sinister sweetness that only her sister understood. Then Aurelian stirred slightly. His eyes fluttered a little, still heavy with sleep. The twins sat up straight again, smiling at him with their usual delicacy. Did you sleep well? Asked Flora in an angelic voice. Yes. I think so, he replied, stretching. Then, seeing their smiles, he raised an eyebrow, amused. Is something wrong? Nothing at all, they said in unison, as if they hadn't just had a conversation that sealed a silent pact between them. Aurelian had slept peacefully. They had watched over him. At that moment, they knew, the destiny they had longed for had already begun to unfold. The whistle of the Hogwarts Express sounded loudly as the train slowed down, approaching King's Cross Station. The hustle and bustle returned with intensity, students unloading suitcases, voices mingling, and the creaking of metal against the rails. Aurelian stepped off the train with a calm stride. The London air had that familiar smell of damp stone and smoke. In the distance, he saw Cedric getting off with a smile, the Weasley twins joking with Lee Jordan, carrying their suitcases chaotically, as was their style. See you, Aurelian! Cedric shouted, raising a hand. Write to me if you get bored of studying. And if not, too, added one of the twins with a laugh. Happy holidays, added the other. Aurelian nodded, smiling at them. He had grown fond of them more than he had expected. They were a breath of fresh air among so many masks, even for someone like him. When his friends disappeared into the crowd, he felt a presence on either side of him. Are you going to forget us? Flora asked in a soft but meaningful voice. We don't plan on forgetting you, added Hestia, with a serene smile and an intensity in her gaze. Aurelian turned his head, recognizing in them that something, beyond ordinary affection. But there was something comforting in their enthusiasm. I won't forget you, he replied honestly. The twins exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance, as if they had won something important. Can we write to you? Asked Flora. Of course, said Aurelian as he took out a small piece of parchment and wrote with his pen without hesitation. This is the address where you can send your owls. He handed it to Hestia, who received it as if it were a valuable relic. So, you have a mansion, she murmured, her eyes sparkling with barely contained excitement. Please don't tell anyone, Aurelian added with a crooked smile. I'd rather keep it a secret for now. Of course, they replied in unison. Then, without asking permission, Hestia hugged him. It was quick, as if she didn't want to make him uncomfortable. Flora offered him a playful little bow, with the sweetness that hid the devotion that pulsed within her. "We'll see you soon," she said. "Don't take too long to reply to our letters," added Hestia with a wink. Aurelian said goodbye with one last look before turning to head for the station exit, carrying his trunk. As he walked away, he couldn't help thinking that those two were anything but ordinary. The twins, for their part, stood watching as he disappeared into the crowd. "The Gaunt mansion," murmured Flora, clutching the parchment to her chest. "He has entrusted us with something precious." "It's already part of us," said Hestia in a soft voice, but with a determination that needed no volume to be heard. "And we'll never let anyone take it away from us." They both smiled. They had planted their place in Aurelian's heart, even if it was small, for now. Chapter 25. Chapter 25. Summer King's Cross Station was still bustling with parents and students. Aurelian, with his trunk silently behind him, made his way through the crowd with a serene expression. His eyes scanned the surroundings until, in a discreet shadow between two stone columns, a hunched figure waited for him. "Stinky," Aurelian whispered with a hint of relief. "Young Aurelian," growled the house elf in a tone that oscillated between devotion and happiness, "did everything go well at the castle?" "Better than I expected," replied the boy, "though not as peaceful as I thought." The two exchanged a knowing glance. Then Aurelian adjusted his cloak and changed his expression slightly, softening it. "Is everything ready?" "Yes, Master. I did as you asked. Dumbledore will know that you returned to St. Emmerich's orphanage, and he won't suspect that you went anywhere else." Stinky himself delivered the message, with an owl from Hogwarts. Aurelian nodded with satisfaction. "Perfect. We'll go to the orphanage first. I won't stay, but I need them to see me." With a snap of his fingers, Stinky took him directly to a discreet corner a few blocks from the orphanage. Aurelian walked over, making noise with his shoes, pretending to be natural. Several children saw him from the fence of the inner garden and greeted him with shouts and clapping. He smiled back at them. The director barely managed to approach him to greet him, surprised that he was back so soon. Aurelian elegantly made up that he had only come for a few things he had forgotten and that he would not be staying the night before moving to another place for the summer. "Headmaster Dumbledore told me I could spend my days off wherever I wanted. And I thought I'd rest in a different, quieter environment." "I hope that's not a problem," he said in his most charming tone. The headmistress, somewhat lost in her thoughts and slightly confused, could only nod with a somewhat tense smile. 20 minutes later, Aurelian was back with Stinky, who was waiting for him in a back street with an old coat covering his pointed ears. "Are we ready now, Master Aurelian?" Aurelian looked back at the orphanage one last time. "Of course, now let's go home." A blink later, they both disappeared in a silent magical burst. They left behind the Muggle city, the hustle and bustle of trains and city traffic, to arrive at the grounds that now belonged unquestionably to the Gaunt heir. The sturdy and charming Gaunt mansion stood in the evening light. The basilisk statues at the entrance stood guard in silence. Their eyes seemed to sparkle, as if they recognized the boy approaching. Aurelian took a deep breath. Home, sweet home, at last. The Gaunt mansion. In the heart of the house was his personal bedroom. Aurelian lay back on a dark velvet sofa, the open curtains allowing him to gaze at the stars in the night sky. The flames in the fireplace danced gently, casting shadows on the walls covered with bookshelves full of books. He had returned home. His first year at Hogwarts had left him with more questions than answers, but also a certainty he hadn't fully understood until now. He had carefully observed teachers, students, and even the ghosts. He had studied their reactions, their attitudes, their limits. All to confirm a single truth: in this world and any other, power is everything, he whispered to himself, his gaze lost in the fire. It was not a phrase uttered at random, nor out of a thirst for power. It was a raw and cold statement, born of experience. In a place where blood, names, lineages, and magic wove complex webs of loyalty, influence, and fear, no one was truly free without power. Magical power opened doors, but political power sealed them so that no one else could enter. Aurelian wanted both. No, he needed both. Not because he longed for a crown or a throne. Not because he dreamed of ruling others. But because he knew that without power, one was always a puppet. A tool. A pawn on someone else's chessboard. It was for that very reason that he never liked the character of Harry Potter. Whenever he read the books or watched the movies, he wondered how someone who was treated worse than a vagrant could trust other people so easily. He never saw Harry make his own decisions, he just let himself be led down the paths that Dumbledore had laid out for him to follow. He knew that his surname would attract attention sooner or later. He could already feel it in the eyes of certain teachers, in the whispers of the students in the hallways. His surname was a burden, but also a key. If he played his cards right, he could turn the shadow of the Gaunts into a banner. One that would make others think twice about attacking him or his loved ones. Am I a dark wizard for wanting power? He pondered. Am I one for using all the tools at my disposal to sculpt my own destiny? The answer was silence. Because it didn't matter. He wasn't seeking the world's approval. If others called him dark for mastering Parseltongue, for experimenting with his own spells, for reading about magic that others avoided, then so be it. He wasn't looking to fit in. He just wanted to understand, master, transform. And if he had to cross boundaries to achieve that, he would cross them. He slowly got up from the sofa and walked over to his desk. On it, several scrolls with designs of magical seals floated in midair. To one side, a list of Muggle companies that he closely followed thanks to his knowledge. In the far corner, his designs for the Knockham broomsticks and an unopened letter from Krivix, which had arrived that afternoon. It was all part of the same project. I'm going to need more allies, he muttered, running his fingers over the surface of the table, as if tracing the map of his next steps. More knowledge. More resources, I need more. And most importantly, time. He turned toward the window. The reflection of his young face overlapped with that of the stars. He was 11 years old. He was just getting started. But inside him was the will of someone who had already lived and lost a lot to be free. I must become someone no one dares to chain. A slight glint in his eyes betrayed the intensity of his decision. He knew the road would be long. He knew he would be judged, perhaps misunderstood, even feared. But he also knew it was all worth it. Aurelian Gaunt would build something new on the ashes of the cursed names that haunted him, and if the magical world did not agree with that, then he would transform it by force. With wisdom. With cunning, and if necessary, with fire. The rain gently tapped on the enchanted stained glass windows of the mansion. In the underground dueling room, the air still vibrated with the echo of the last spells. Sweat beaded on Aurelian's forehead, but his breathing was calm and controlled. He sat in the middle of the practice circle, his robe unbuttoned, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, covered with runes that glimmered faintly. Every day he felt more attuned, more focused. He had perfected the way he channeled his magic even without a wand, and his control over silent spells already surpassed that of many adults. Even so, training was exhausting. Not because of the physical effort, but because of the concentration required to keep his mind clear and sharp as a dagger. He sighed and let his body lie down on the cold floor, seeking a momentary rest. He closed his eyes, allowing recent memories to envelop him. The meeting with Krivix had been brief but substantial. As always, the goblin wasted no time with unnecessary words. All agricultural plots are officially operational, he had said, handing him a scroll with reports from local administrators. The first harvests are already being sold to potion makers and allied distributors. Mainly basic ingredients, but of high quality. The land turned out to be more fertile than we projected. Aurelian nodded without surprise. He knew that the land had high magical potential due to its history, not just for agricultural use. Some of it was located on ancient natural energy nodes. As for your properties, Krivix continued, unfolding another map, the restoration of the workshop in Godric's Hollow is complete. We preserved the original structure, but reinforced everything with modern enchantments. The premises in Diagon Alley are now officially yours. It's located on one of the side streets, but with the right promotion, it will attract attention. The shop in Hogsmeade has also been restored, as you requested, and is ready for business. Aurelian smiled slightly when he heard this. Everything was going according to plan. And the company? Gaunt Corp, replied the goblin with satisfaction, is now registered in both the Wizarding World and certain Muggle commercial networks. We will start with the Knockham brooms as soon as you authorize the first prototypes. Aurelian did not respond at that moment. But inside, his mind was already working on the next phases, expansion and political presence. He slowly returned to the present, still lying on the cold tiles of the basement. He opened his eyes and gazed at the stone ceiling for a moment longer. He had everything he needed to get started, the Gaunt mansion, the old Gaunt cottage, which he planned to transform into a secondary base. It was already protected and hidden among the woods. The farm plots, strategically distributed and already in production. The workshop in Godric's Hollow, a place steeped in magical history that would now be his experimental development base. The shop in Hogsmeade, perfect for direct contact with students and magical families. And the new premises in Diagon Alley, the cornerstone for launching his brand and presenting himself as an entrepreneur to the magical world. He slowly got up, letting his magic shake off its lethargy like an animal stretching its claws. Everything was moving forward. Everything was responding to a goal that only he knew. He allowed himself a slight smile, calm but full of determination. He still had a long way to go. But he was building it stone by stone. No one was giving him anything, and someday, when everyone looked back, they would not see Voldemort's heir or the last Gaunt. They would see Aurelian. The one who built his own empire from scratch. In the library of Gaunt Manor, Aurelian slowly turned the pages of an ancient, dusty tome entitled Myths and Occult Symbolism of the Magical World. He had been reviewing texts on alchemy formulas and fragments of unofficial history. That was when he saw it. A simple symbol, engraved in black ink, a triangle, a circle, and a vertical line. The Deathly Hallows. He frowned slightly and silently read the brief passage, 3 gifts given by death itself, an unbeatable wand, a stone that brings echoes from beyond, and a cloak that defies even the eyes of the Grim Reaper. Aurelian leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. It wasn't the first time he had heard tales of legendary objects, but there was something about that symbol, the way it was written, that made him slightly uncomfortable. It wasn't a fable like the others. The Elder Wand. The Resurrection Stone. The Invisibility Cloak. The Deathly Hallows, he whispered softly, barely a whisper among the shelves. He knew them. He had admired them. He had loved them. And now, more than ever, he understood their value, but above all their danger. Seeing them named here, in a book forgotten by time, in this world where everything seemed more alive, more complex, sent a chill down his spine. Chapter 26, Chapter 26 Resurrection Stone. The sky above Gaunt Manor was covered with grey clouds, like the memory of a fading dream. In the library, the silence was absolute, broken only by the faint scratching of a quill on parchment. Aurelian was not writing, nor was he reading. He was simply thinking, his eyes fixed on the symbol he had seen before. A triangle. A circle. A straight line. The Deathly Hallows. The words resonated with a different weight now. The Elder Wand is with Dumbledore. He must have claimed it when he defeated Grindelwald. According to the canon, that's how it should be. Besides, no one has been able to match him in a duel since then. His gaze drifted toward a bookshelf, as if he could see beyond the stone walls. The cloak of invisibility must also be in Dumbledore's possession, after obtaining it from James Potter. He will surely return it to Harry in his first year. He closed his eyes and sighed. But it wasn't the wand or the cloak that mattered to him. It was the third one. The Resurrection Stone. There was no doubt in his mind. He knew exactly where to look for it. The Gaunt family ring. The one his father stole from his uncle Morphin. The one he also turned into a Horcrux. Now, if his calculations were correct, it was there. Waiting among the dust and history of a broken family. Aurelian clenched his fists. I don't want to resurrect the dead. I'm not that foolish. His voice was barely a whisper, but it was firm. But if there's a chance to see her, even if it's just once. To hear her voice. To know what she was like beyond the few memories I have. I can't ignore it. The idea of seeing Elaine Harper, his mother, even if it was an illusion, a fleeting projection of magic. What would you say to her? That her son remembers her, even though he never knew her? That he grew up alone? That he thinks about her from time to time? He stood up. That summer would no longer be just for rest or training. There was a path he had to follow. A truth he wanted to know and see with his own eyes. He was going to find that ring and talk to his mother. Aurelian walked through the silent corridors of Gaunt Manor. His mind was working overtime, organizing every step, every variable. Observe. Anticipate. Control. He knew the ring would not be unprotected. Not if his father had turned it into a Horcrux. I remember the effects. Dumbledore was cursed when he touched it. A dark, ancient, and swift magic. Activated on contact. If my memories serve me right, the curse is still active, waiting for its next victim. Aurelian stopped in front of a window. Outside, the wind gently rustled the treetops of the nearby forest. The ring was in the cabin, and he was going to retrieve it. But he would not be reckless. He was not the one who would touch the ring. He summoned Stinky with a snap of his fingers. The elf appeared immediately, bowing his head. Did you call me master? Aurelian watched him for a few seconds before speaking, his tone neutral, as if requesting a routine report. I need you to find a vagrant. Just one. Someone no one will miss, someone no one will look for if they disappear. Bring them here. Stinky looked up for a moment, confused. A vagrant, master? For what purpose? That's not important to you, Aurelian said calmly. But he must have no family, no history. A piece of trash. There are enough of those in the world, aren't there? The elf swallowed, his ears twitching slightly, but he did not argue. As you wish, Master Aurelian. He disappeared with a slight pop. Alone again, Aurelian crossed his arms. He felt no remorse. He couldn't afford that luxury. The magical world despises the weak. The Muggle world ignores them. I won't do anything worse than what life has already done to them. He looked at his reflection in the windowpane. What he saw reminded him of his father. Not in his face, but in his determination. This isn't cruelty, he murmured. It's just doing what's necessary to achieve my goals, he reminded himself. If he wanted to survive what was coming, then he couldn't back down from difficult decisions. Let someone else suffer the curse. I'll just watch. I'll analyze, and then, the ring will be mine. And finally, he would be able to see his mother. Under the thick canopy of trees, Aurelian waited at the edge of the path leading to Gaunt's cabin. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The air was damp, even the sounds of the forest seemed muffled, as if something older and darker claimed this place. Then, with a slight pop, Stinky appeared beside him. I brought him, master, the elf announced in a low voice, pointing with a trembling bow to the man behind him. He was a human wreck, dirty, hunched over, his clothes barely holding together. The vagrant's eyes were red from alcohol or some drug, he was like a dog without a will. Aurelian knew instantly that he would serve. "Well done, Stinky," he said coldly. "You may leave now. Do not intervene, no matter what happens." The elf hesitated, but nodded, and disappeared. Aurelian turned to the vagrant. He took out his wand. "I don't want any mistakes." He pointed at the man. Imperious, the magic flowed smoothly, steadily, without resistance. The man's eyes relaxed even more, his will abandoning him completely. Aurelian smiled. "Walk," he ordered. "I will guide you." Under the spell of the forbidden spell, they crossed the threshold of the forest. The vegetation grew thicker as they advanced, the trees taller, more twisted. Here and there, gnarled roots protruded from the ground like deformed fingers. Aurelian walked behind, attentive to every step, guiding the enchanted man with precision. The gaunt cottage finally emerged from among the trees, a miserable structure, almost swallowed up by the undergrowth, with walls that creaked at the slightest breath of wind. But even in its ruin, it radiated something rotten. The air was denser here. Heavier. Almost sticky. The mark of a Horcrux. "Go in," Aurelian ordered. Aurelian did not enter. He remained at the door, watching. The vagrant obeyed, pushing the door open with a sharp squeak. The interior was covered in dust, cobwebs, and the stench of decay. The vagabond moved forward slowly. His movements were mechanical, empty. His dull eyes scanned the cabin, the remains of a fireplace, the rotten furniture. Then Aurelian guided him. "The drawer of the table, open it." Inside, like a jewel buried in the dust of oblivion, lay the ring. The gaunt seal still glowed faintly beneath the grime, as if patiently awaiting its rediscovery. The vagabond reached out his hand, and hell broke loose. Aurelian felt the magical wave instantly. A burst of darkness swept through the room, hissing. A magical screech emerged from the ring, a dissonant note made of hatred and malice. The vagrant screamed. It was an inhuman scream. His body shook violently, as if each of his bones were being broken one by invisible hands. His eyes rolled back, his veins darkened and swelled beneath his skin. He began to bleed from his nose, ears, mouth, and fingernails. His flesh began to tear from within, as if he were being punished for all his sins at once. He fell to his knees, convulsing, as the curse slowly devoured him. Aurelian did not look away. He felt no pleasure, but neither did he feel guilt. He had been born into a cruel world, and equally cruel decisions were necessary if you wanted to survive. Finally, the vagrant fell to the ground, dead. His face was still frozen in a grimace of pure pain. The ring lay beside him. The punishment had been meted out. The curse had been lifted. Aurelian stepped inside. He approached carefully, avoiding the corpse. He took out an enchanted handkerchief and wrapped the ring precisely. Then he stored it in a small, magically armored box, with a final protection sealed with his blood. "It wasn't beautiful," he murmured, almost to himself, "but it was what was required." He left the cabin silently, leaving the body behind as yet another echo of the evil that inhabited that place. The stone of resurrection was now in his possession. And with it, the possibility of looking into the eyes of the one he most wanted to see again. Back at Gaunt Manor, Aurelian found himself alone in the room, surrounded by silence. The ring, still wrapped in the handkerchief, rested on the table reinforced with magical containment runes. He had brought it there to study it calmly. He was in no hurry. He had already confirmed that the ring's curse had been broken with the death of the vagabond. Now all that remained was to face the most important thing, the relic, and above all, the soul fragment. Aurelian carefully untied the knot in the handkerchief, exposing the ring to the dim candle light. The black stone, engraved with the symbol of the Deathly Hallows, remained embedded in the ancient gold band. It glowed faintly. He took the ring between his fingers with great care. Then he felt it. A presence. It was not an invasion, nor a direct attack. It was not like hostile legilimency or an active curse. It was something more subtle. As if something recognized him. Something that had been waiting for him. The fragment of soul enclosed in the ring did not attack him. It did not try to dominate his mind or corrupt his thoughts. Instead, Aurelian felt an echo, a deep sadness. Like a distant reflection of what he had perceived months ago when he had magically connected with the remnants of his father's soul. It was as if that fragment knew who he was and, rather than defending itself, was observing him. "You're not in the stone," Aurelian whispered, looking closely. "You're in the ring." He was right. Extending his magical perception, he felt that the stone itself was clean, inert, but the gold band, the ring itself, was the container of Voldemort's fragment. With steady hands, he took a small magical tool and carefully removed the stone from the ring. He didn't need to risk the relic by leaving it next to the Horcrux. Once separated, the stone was stored in a small box with protective runes. The ring, on the other hand, he placed inside a more secure box, sealed with multiple spells of containment, alarm, and isolation. His father's soul would have to wait. "Someday, I'll decide what to do with you. But not today," he murmured, closing the box with a snap of magical energy. He remained silent for a moment, looking at the two boxes, one containing the past he wished to revive, and the other containing a legacy he could not ignore. Chapter 27, Chapter 27. A week had passed since Aurelian recovered the ring and with it the stone of resurrection. During those days, he kept it in a box in his study in the mansion, without touching it, not even with magic. Just observing it, feeling its power, its history. It was not a tool to be used lightly. But tonight, it would be different. The moon was high in the clear sky, casting its silvery light on the windows of the mansion's large library. Aurelian had carefully moved the stone to the center of the room, placing circles of containment around it, not to control whoever came, but to maintain the magical atmosphere. At his side was his faithful companion Stinky, ears lowered and eyes fixed on the stone. "Master, are you sure about this?" asked the elf, with a mixture of respect and some fear. Aurelian did not answer immediately. He only stroked the surface of the stone with his fingers. Its texture was cold, as if it weighed more than its size should allow. "Stinky, have you heard of the Deathly Hallows?" The elf blinked. "Just legends, master. Stories of mad wizards chasing tales. The tale of the three brothers, things to scare children." Aurelian nodded slowly. "That's what I thought too. That they were also legends. But that stone is real." He held the stone up to the moonlight, where its engraving glowed faintly. "This is the real resurrection stone." Stinky stepped back a little, as if the relic emitted an aura too powerful for his senses. "And you plan to use it? To call a soul back? Just one? Just one?" Silence filled the room. Stinky knew who he was talking about. Aurelian stood up, letting a black velvet cloak fall from his shoulders. He focused completely on controlling his breathing. He let his magic align with the stone. "I just want to see her, for real," he murmured. In a clear, firm voice, he turned the stone 3 times in his hand, just as he remembered. The air changed. The temperature dropped slightly, as if the world had held its breath. A pale mist began to rise from the ground. Stinky took a step back, stifling a scream. Then slowly a figure began to materialize in front of Aurelian. Tall, thin, with long hair falling over her shoulders. She wore a soft, unadorned tunic, her deep, bright eyes instinctively seeking out the boy in front of her. It was Elaine Harper. For a moment, neither she nor Aurelian said a word. Time seemed to stretch out, as if they both knew that what was coming should not be rushed. Aurelian did not cry. But his lips parted slightly, trembling. Elaine looked at him, and smiled. Not with surprise. Not with fear. But with tenderness, with love. It was then that she spoke for the first time. "Hello, my child." Elaine did not take her eyes off Aurelian, even when a short figure with large ears approached with reverent, almost trembling steps. Stinky stopped just before Elaine, bowing his head until his forehead almost touched the ground. "My lady Elaine. Stinky welcomes you," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "It's been so long, and yet, you're still just as brilliant." Elaine turned her face toward him, gently. Her serene eyes opened slightly as she recognized him. "Stinky," she whispered, her voice seeming to come from a distant corner of time. "You were always so loyal." Stinky sobbed, shedding a few tears, a mixture of joy and melancholy fluttering in his chest. He stood up with dignity, which in a domestic elf was quite a statement, and looked at her with pride. Stinky kept his promise. He took little Aurelian and brought him to safety. He watched over him from afar. "But he is no longer a helpless child, ma'am. He is now a great wizard. Truly. He is intelligent, strong, powerful like no other of his age. He has achieved more than any human or elf could imagine." Aurelian, still motionless, let out a small smile when he heard the elf's words. Elaine, who until then had maintained a gentle expression, frowned slightly with concern. "Powerful," she repeated, as if the word hurt her a little. "Is he happy?" she asked. Stinky blinked. He looked down for just a moment. "He does what he must, my lady. He carries a heavy burden, but he has also laughed, made friends, he has noble goals. In his own way. I think he is trying." Elaine looked at her son, now with a mixture of emotions ranging from pride to sorrow. Aurelian didn't look away. It didn't matter how vulnerable he felt. This was his mother, and he wasn't going to lose her in silence. "Stinky." Elaine murmured softly, "Thank you for taking care of him all this time." The elf bowed once more, before slowly turning to Aurelian with a faint, moist smile. "Stinky will leave the young master with his mother," he said, his voice still trembling with emotion. "This moment is yours alone." And without waiting for a response, he disappeared in a slight flicker. Only mother and son remained. The air grew thicker, more intimate. Slowly approaching her son, her ethereal footsteps made no sound, but her presence seemed to fill the entire room. Her eyes, the same eyes Aurelian saw in the mirror every morning, looked at him with a mixture of love, curiosity and an impossible-to-hide sadness. "You've grown so much, more than I ever imagined you would without me," she whispered, as if each word were a caress. Aurelian swallowed hard. He had prepared himself mentally for this, but no spell, book or theory could cushion the emotional blow of standing before his mother. A woman he had only known through the memories of others and abstract dreams. "I haven't just grown up, mother. I've changed too," he said, his voice deep. "I'm not just Aurelian. There's something else inside me, something that came from another world. Memories, ideas, visions. I don't know if I'm who I was meant to be." Elaine looked at him silently, then nodded gently. "I know. I felt it when you were born. There was something different inside you. But the most important thing is that you are my son above all else. I feel it in my soul." Aurelian lowered his gaze. "Sometimes I wonder if what I'm doing is right. If this quest for power, control, knowledge, is turning me into something different. Something you wouldn't have wanted me to be." Elaine took another step forward, until she was standing right in front of him. She raised a translucent hand and placed it on his cheek. Aurelian felt a slight tingling sensation, not like a physical touch, but like a brush against his magic, against his soul. "Are you doing this out of hatred?" she asked. "No. I'm doing it for freedom. To protect the little that matters to me in this world," Aurelian replied without hesitation. "Then you're not losing yourself. Sometimes, those who have to change the world, Can't always do it with clean hands, she whispered. Aurelian closed his eyes, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. Mother, there's so much I want to tell you. So many questions. About you. About my father. Elaine smiled bitterly. Tom. She whispered, more to herself than to him. He was like a bottomless pit. For a brief moment, I thought I could fill it. That I could pull him out of his darkness. I saw a frightened child in him. I saw humanity, before he buried it forever. Aurelian remained silent. Elaine lowered her hand, her face bathed in nostalgia. I don't regret having you. Despite the pain, despite what it cost. You are the only beautiful thing that came out of all that. Did you love him? Aurelian asked, unable to help himself. Elaine hesitated. Her face reflected a struggle of emotions that, even in her spiritual state, remained latent. Yes. But it wasn't a healthy love. It was like loving a storm. You can't hold on to it, you can only hope it doesn't destroy you in the process. Silence fell for a few seconds. Aurelian looked at her with a gaze that was not that of a child, but of someone who had lived more than time would suggest. I wanted to see you again, he finally said. I want you to come back. Not just for today. Elaine looked at him with infinite sweetness. The stone doesn't give life, Aurelian. It only allows the echo of what we were. I no longer belong to this world, but I'll come if you call me. I'll always be with you. A tear ran down Aurelian's face. Thank you for giving me life. Elaine smiled and leaned down to kiss his forehead, though there was no contact. And you, thank you for not wasting it. Elaine stood in front of him, looking at his face tenderly, as if she still couldn't believe that the young wizard in front of her was the same one she had given birth to with her last breath. Aurelian. She said, breaking the silence softly. Tell me about yourself. About your life. Where have you been all this time? How have you lived? Aurelian blinked, his heart still pounding with the excitement of having her there. For a moment, everything he had planned to say to her, everything he thought he had under control, turned into a whirlwind of emotions in his chest. Do you want to know everything? He asked, his voice lower than usual. Elaine smiled, with that same smile that, according to Stinky, had saved her from her father's darkness. I want to know everything. Every detail. Every joy, every pain. I never thought this moment would come. Aurelian nodded slowly. He sat down in front of her. The atmosphere became intimate, almost suspended in time, with the candles flickering softly and the stone on the table radiating a faint, warm heat. Elaine sat down beside him, or at least, the spiritual projection that she now was took shape beside him. Then. I'll begin, Aurelian said calmly. Thus, without haste, as if the night would never end, he began to tell his story. He took a deep breath and began to speak, letting the words flow with the naturalness of someone who finally feels understood. I was in an orphanage since I was born, he began, looking at his mother's serene face, San Americo. It wasn't a warm place, but I survived. I learned to take care of myself. I always knew I was different, that there was something else inside me. Elaine listened silently, with full attention, as if she were reconstructing with her eyes every memory her son shared with her. One day I met Stinky. He promised to protect me, and he has, Aurelian continued with a slight smile. He told me about you, about your story, and he was the one who reminded me that I wasn't alone. Elaine brought a hand to her chest, moved. After that, I decided I wouldn't just be a lost orphan. I took the Gaunt surname. Krivix, a brilliant goblin, helped me recover the family's wealth. I bought land, restored properties. He paused briefly. I also reclaimed the mansion that once belonged to my father's family. Although now it bears the Gaunt surname. Elaine nodded gently, proudly. You've done more than I ever imagined. she said softly. This year was my first year at Hogwarts. I learned much more than I expected. About magic, about the world, and about what it means to live with others, Aurelian said thoughtfully. I met Cedric, who is very kind, the Weasley twins, who are, how shall I put it, cheerful, very cheerful, and two very peculiar girls, Hestia and Flora Caro. Elaine looked at him with an arched eyebrow, amused. Peculiar? In what way are they peculiar? Aurelian hesitated slightly. They're very close to me. They're protective, insistent, different. I don't really know how to explain it. Elaine let out a light, soft, vibrant laugh that seemed to fill the room. Aurelian, dear, those girls might not just be your friends, she said mischievously. Aurelian rolled his eyes with a slight smile. Don't start. No, no, replied his mother with a mischievous tone. I'm just saying you should pay attention. Sometimes affection disguises itself in many ways, and some girls can be very determined. They both laughed together, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The light from the stone began to fade, the energy that sustained the connection slowly dissipating. Elaine noticed it first and nodded sweetly. I have to go now. But call me whenever you want. I'll be waiting. Aurelian bowed his head, a glint in his eyes. I will. I promise. I'm so proud of you, Aurelian. Elaine whispered, just before fading into a soft halo of light. Stinky appeared and looked down, while Aurelian remained silent, his expression serene. He had spoken to his mother, and those emotions would stay with him forever. Chapter 28 Chapter 28 The Weasleys. A little over a month had passed since Hogwarts closed its doors for the summer holidays, and Gaunt Manor remained quiet, immersed in the slow pace that Aurelian had imposed on it. In the spacious halls, his shadow was the only one that roamed the corridors. The gardens bloomed with each passing day, and amid all that silence, Aurelian devoted his mornings to a constant task, reading, and answering letters. On his desk lay a stack of carefully aligned envelopes, each marked with the same red wax seal, 2 intertwined roses. It was the symbol of the Caro sisters, something they had adopted to differentiate their correspondence from the rest. Aurelian recognized them effortlessly, although it wasn't as if he received any other kind of letter. He had read each of those letters more than once. The first ones were sweet, affectionate, but as the days passed, their tone had changed. Flora's words became increasingly intense, full of phrases about how unbearable the distance was, while Hestia's, in more polished prose, let slip disturbing phrases between the lines. Have you met other girls? I hope not. We think about you all the time. We dream about you. We wait for you. Always. Some letters had ink stains. Others arrived with dried flowers, and one even contained, without explanation, a lock of hair tied with a ribbon. Aurelian knew obsession when he saw it, and although he would never admit it out loud, part of him enjoyed the intensity with which they looked at him, thought about him, demanded him. He picked up his pen and began to write calmly, Dear Hestia and Flora, your letters have arrived on time, as always. I am glad to know that you are well, although I also notice how much you miss me. Everything here is going as usual. I practice spells every day and continue to grow in many ways. The mansion becomes more mine with every day I spend there. I appreciate the attention you give me. I know that for you this goes beyond ordinary friendship, and I don't mind. I can't promise you what direction all this will take, but I can promise that I will never forget you. We will see each other soon. Aurelian Gaunt. It wasn't a cold letter, but he didn't write more than necessary either. He let the ink dry while he gazed at the horizon from his study window. Light streamed in through the large windows. Responding to the young ladies again, Master Aurelian asked Stinky as he entered with a tray. I don't want them to feel ignored, he replied without looking at him. Although, frankly, they are intense. Those girls adore you, sir. They talk as if you were the sun and the moon, said the elf with a slight shiver in his voice. Have you seen the letter that came with a small enchanted dagger? Aurelian nodded. They said it was to protect me, or protect themselves from anyone who wants to separate us. Stinky muttered something under his breath that sounded like crazy witches, but he didn't press the issue. Aurelian sealed the letter with his ring and handed it to the elf. Send it today. Make sure it arrives before nightfall. As you command, replied the elf with a bow. When he was alone, Aurelian rested a hand on the desk and closed his eyes. What kind of bond are we creating? It wasn't love. Not in the traditional sense. It was a form of enveloping devotion, suffocating even with all its sweetness. But the strangest thing was that he didn't feel the need to pull away. Only, to control it. And at least for now, he could do that. Aurelian was in the private library of Gaunt Manor, surrounded by the faint crackling of enchanted candles and the occasional fluttering of curtains in a breeze coming from the windows. On the desk lay sheets of parchment, each already begun with firm, elegant handwriting. He was writing letters to his friends Cedric and the Weasley twins. The first one was already finished and folded. It was addressed to Cedric Diggory. Hi Cedric, I hope you're enjoying the holidays with your family. Everything is going well here. I'm keeping busy with my studies and training, nothing out of the ordinary. I guess, like you, I'm already feeling a little anxious about going back to Hogwarts. I hope we can meet up soon, maybe on the train back. Take care. Aurelian. The letter to the twins was more informal, more relaxed, but just as he was writing the last paragraph, something popped into his mind. An image. A memory. Peter Pettigrew, or rather, Wormtail. Aurelian narrowed his eyes, remaining motionless for a few seconds as he held the pen. He remembered clearly, Pettigrew had survived Sirius Black's attack and had hidden as an animagus at the Weasleys' house, in the form of a rat. Could it be possible that the same story would repeat itself in this world? If he was at the Weasleys' house, it was an opportunity. He knew that the timeline was not identical to that in the books, but he couldn't ignore the possibility. Precisely, and without changing the cheerful tone of the letter, he wrote the last lines, "Greetings, Fred and George. I hope you're enjoying an explosive vacation. I'm keeping busy here, although I miss the joyful chaos you two cause together. By the way, I was thinking, would it be possible to visit you one of these days? I'd love to see your home. Besides, I'm curious to see if such mischief runs in the family. Let me know if it's possible. I can get there on my own." Aurelian. A smile spread across his face as he rolled up both letters and tied them neatly. It wasn't an urgent request, it wouldn't arouse suspicion, but it would be enough to open a door. Stinky entered at that moment. "Ready to send, Master?" Aurelian nodded and handed him both scrolls. One for Cedric. The other for the Weasley twins, at the burrow. Make sure they arrive without fail. Aurelian let out a short laugh and sat back down, watching Stinky disappear. He closed his eyes for a few seconds. If Pettigrew is there, I'll know soon enough. Aurelian walked toward the edge of a green hill covered with wild flowers, following the magical coordinates the twins had sent him. Before him stood a chaotic and charming structure, the burrow. The house seemed to grow on itself in impossible layers, held up by pure magic and stubborn optimism. Crooked chimneys, slanted windows, flower pots hanging from places where no one in their right mind would put anything, and yet, everything seemed to have its place. It was exactly as he remembered it from his past life, yet warmer and more alive than he ever imagined. Not a minute passed before the door creaked and swung open. "Aurelian," two voices said in unison. Fred and George appeared, both with huge smiles and half-buttoned robes. One of them had an ink stain on his cheek, the other a piece of parchment stuck to his elbow. Come in, come in. Mom's a little nervous about receiving such a distinguished visitor," Fred joked. "But don't worry, we told her you weren't like the Blacks." "Not even like Percy," added George with a laugh. Aurelian entered calmly, observing every detail with attentive eyes. The house smelled of freshly baked bread, magical mint, and chimney dust. It was a real place, full of life. "Stay still," whispered one of the twins, "and get ready." "For what?" asked Aurelian just before he heard. "Where's the guest?" boomed a voice from the kitchen. Molly Weasley appeared with her apron covered in flour and an anxious smile. Beside his was Arthur, with a wrench floating next to him like a faithful dog. Behind them peered curious Ron, little Ginny, and a young man with square glasses, Percy. "Oh, it's you. But how well dressed you are. So polite, I'm sure," said Molly before gently shaking his shoulder, as if he were her own son. Arthur extended a firm hand. "Arthur Weasley. Welcome, boy. The twins have told us about you, which I think is a good sign." "Aurelian Gaunt," replied the young man with a slight bow and a polite smile. "It's an honor to meet you. Thank you for welcoming me into your home." Arthur's eyes widened slightly at the mention of Gaunt, but he hid it well. Well, it's not every day we have a Gaunt at the Burrow," he muttered. "And even less so one who isn't growling or casting curses," added George with a laugh. Molly clapped her hands. "Great! Well, sit down, I've prepared a lunch fit for a champion. Ron, Ginny, come closer, don't be shy." Aurelian was led to the wooden dining room, where the seats creaked but were comfortable. As they talked about Hogwarts, the teachers, and the twins' mischief, Aurelian noticed something moving near the floor. A fat, greyish rat with a somewhat strange eye slipped between the legs of a chair. "There you are," he thought with a serene smile, watching as the creature hid under the cupboard. He made no gesture that betrayed his attention. He just enjoyed the food, the stories, and the warmth of home. Aurelian finished a second slice of molasses cake with a satisfied smile. Molly Weasley, looking proud, poured him some more pumpkin juice and gently ruffled his hair, as if he were already part of the family. The afternoon wore on as the sun bathed the crooked windows of the burrow in golden light. The twins literally dragged him up to the third floor, where they shared a room, and began showing him magical inventions still in the testing phase. "This powder turns eyebrows into thorns for 10 minutes, said Fred, waving a small green bottle. "We're still working on the part where they stop itching." "And this one," added George, "makes quills right backwards. We tried it on Percy. He didn't notice until the end of his essay on ethics and responsibility in the wand registration office." Aurelian chuckled softly. He was always amazed by the twins' creativity. "They're dangerously brilliant," he commented in a neutral tone. "With the right guidance, they could be true alchemists of chaos." Fred bowed dramatically. "At your service, Captain Gaunt." George joined him with a theatrical salute. "Always ready for the next disaster." Later, they went down to the garden where Ron was throwing stones at an enchanted barrel that spun around and around. Ginny, more shy, drew things on the ground with a stick. Aurelian joined them briefly, levitating Ron's stones so they would aim better. "Do you always make magic look so easy?" Ron asked, frowning. Aurelian just shrugged. "It's practice, and a lot of patience." Ginny looked at him curiously, her eyes narrowed. "You are different, not weird, just different." "I hear that a lot," Aurelian replied with a small smile. "Although I still can't decide if it's a compliment or a warning." As the sun set and the sky turned from lavender to deep blue, the family gathered for dinner. Floating candles lit the table as conversation flowed amid laughter and anecdotes. Aurelian participated with his usual calm, but his attentive gaze did not miss a single gesture. In particular, the thin trail left by the fat rat as it disappeared through a hole under the stairs. Arthur Weasley told him about his work at the Department of Misuse of Muggle Artifacts, and Aurelian responded with questions about plugs, electricity, and radios. Molly commented that he was the most polite child she had met since Bill as she served him another slice of cake. That night, Aurelian slept in one of the spare rooms, with clean sheets and a pillow that fit his neck. Before going to bed, he took out his small leather diary and wrote, "The Weasleys are real. Warm, messy, and a bit noisy. But real. Fred and George could be valuable allies in the future. Arthur is a wiser man than he appears. Molly, maternal, can be a bit intrusive. There's a bond here. I recognize it. That makes them fascinating." He closed the diary and turned off the light with a wave of his hand. Chapter 29, Chapter 29. Shopping. The August sun filtered through the curtains of the mansion's main bedroom. Aurelian lay on his bed, his wand resting on a table next to a cup of tea with fresh mint leaves from his own gardens. The silence of the mansion was broken only by the occasional song of a distant bird or the soft rustling of leaves. A breather before the new year at Hogwarts. Then, without warning, Stinky appeared at the foot of the bed, bowing and holding a letter in his hands. "Master Aurelian," said the elf in a respectful and amused voice, "this letter arrived, from the young ladies." Aurelian raised an eyebrow and took the letter. On the parchment were enchanted flowers that opened and closed with the warmth of his fingers. The calligraphy was impeccable, artistic, and excessively adorned with hearts. He tore the seal and began to read. "Dear Aurelian, we, Hestia and Flora, have decided that we couldn't start the new school year without seeing you, without hearing your voice. We wanted to invite you to meet us at Diagon Alley to do our school shopping together. It would be the greatest pleasure and perhaps, the only moment of true joy before we are once again trapped at Hogwarts among people who simply don't understand. We have dreamed of this moment. Please don't keep us waiting. Your destiny is with us. With love, H&FPS, bring your smile." "We need it." Aurelian held the letter in front of him for a few more seconds, contemplating each word, then smiled. It was a gentle smile. "They're completely crazy," he muttered, as if it were already inevitable. Then he looked at Stinky and spoke softly. "But I like them." The elf looked at him with an indecipherable expression. "Are you going to see them, sir?" Aurelian stood up, still holding the letter. He stretched out his arms and let the magic of the place make a book on his bed disappear. "Yes, I will. It's time to buy what I need, and there's no reason to avoid their company." He looked at the letter again. "Your destiny is with us." Aurelian folded it carefully and walked over to his desk, where he had already prepared parchment, black ink, and his favorite pen. He sat down, thoughtful for a moment, while Stinky watched him silently. Then he wrote a reply. He signed and sealed it with a simple spell to look at Stinky. "Deliver it directly." Stinky nodded solemnly and disappeared with a soft pop. Aurelian leaned back briefly in a chair, crossing his arms behind his head. "At least it won't be boring." With a smile, he stared out the window at the sky, wondering how much the Carrows had changed since he last saw them. The Carrow twins' shared bedroom was a perfect blend of symmetry and perfection. The dark green curtains were carefully drawn, the books stacked precisely. They sat side by side, as always. Their legs crossed in sync, their hair styled identically. Stinky appeared from the shadows, bowed low, and handed them a small sealed letter. "From young Master Aurelian," he said respectfully before vanishing. Both girls remained motionless for a second. Then Flora took the letter. Hestia approached from behind, resting her chin on her shoulder, wanting to read the reply at the same time. Her eyes shone with an inhuman intensity. As they read, their pupils dilated with every word. "He will come," said Flora, her lips trembling. "He will accompany us," added Hestia, with a smile. Both slowly lowered the letter, as if it were a sacred object. "Don't dream too much about me," Flora repeated in a whisper, referring to a phrase in the letter. "We already dream about you, every day," whispered Hestia, almost in a trance. They looked at each other, with the same idea burning in their hearts. The world was full of threats, of smiling idiots like Cedric or the annoying Weasley twins. They all talked to Aurelian. They all looked at him. They all tried to get close to him. But only they truly loved him. Only they understood him. "Tomorrow, will be just for us," said Flora, in a soft tone, as she ran her fingers along the edge of the envelope. "And after that too," added Hestia, her gaze lost in nothingness. "We'll do whatever it takes. Whatever it takes." Then, in an act as synchronized as ever, they kissed the edge of the parchment and placed it next to a portrait of Aurelian that they had made themselves. "We'll see each other soon," they whispered in unison. The usual bustle of families buying books, robes, cauldrons, and wands filled the air with a constant murmur. Children's laughter, hurried footsteps, and the jingle of galleons mingled in a chaotic but warm symphony in Diagon Alley. Aurelian stood in front of Flourish and Blott's bookshop, his hands in his pockets and his gaze somewhat distracted, watching the crowd. He was wearing a rather elegant robe, and although his expression was serene, his senses were as alert as ever. Two familiar figures approached. He turned and saw them at that very moment. Hestia and Flora were running toward him from the corner of the Quidditch shop, their robes fluttering behind them. "Aurelian!" they shouted in unison. Before he could respond, they had already reached him. Both threw themselves into his arms, tightly and tenderly at the same time. It was a warm, possessive embrace. As if they were trying to make sure he was there. As if they feared that if they didn't hold him tight enough, he would disappear. Aurelian blinked, surprised. He had learned something important. Their affection, though strange in its intensity, was not always a threat. "We're so happy to see you," said Flora, without letting go. "We missed you, so much," whispered Hestia, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm happy to see you too," he replied, offering them a slight smile as he gently pulled away. They both smiled back at him. "Ready to get school supplies?" he asked, taking the initiative again. "With you, always," they said, perfectly in sync. The three walked down the alley. It was a strange scene. The twins kept pace with him as if they had rehearsed it 1,000 times, their eyes alert to anyone who dared to look at him. As they bought books, potions, and scrolls, Aurelian noticed something curious: no vendor seemed to dare address him directly. Not because of his last name or his presence, but because of the looks Hestia and Flora gave when someone got too close. "Do you already have a new cauldron?" asked Flora, leaning over to look at her list. "I do, but, thanks for the offer," replied Aurelian calmly, knowing that arguing with them would only make them insist even more. They finished their tour just before tea time, stopping in front of Fortescue's. Hestia, as if reading his mind, asked, "Ice cream, Aurelian?" "Only if you have some too," he said with a smile. They sat at a secluded table under a parasol that emitted a soft blue glow. Aurelian tasted his ice cream while watching the twins, one on each side, stare at him silently as they ate. They said nothing, but their eyes spoke for them. The ice cream had melted halfway when Aurelian put his spoon down. Not because he wasn't hungry, but because he felt Hestia and Flora's persistent gazes like two invisible threads delicately enveloping him. They didn't talk much when the three of them were alone, there was no need. They shared a language beyond words. "We only have one more place to go, right?" asked Aurelian as he stood up. "Madame Malkin's," they said in unison, rising immediately. As they made their way through the crowd, Aurelian noticed that people moved aside when they saw them. It was because of the strangeness and unusual energy that surrounded them, a pale young man with a deep gaze, accompanied by two identical girls who radiated intense affection. It was as if they were in a completely different world from the one everyone else inhabited. They entered Madame Malkin's shop, where the seamstress greeted them with her classic professional smile. "Welcome, welcome. Come in, she said professionally. Aurelian nodded. The twins also sat on the stools, their movements perfectly synchronized, while their measurements were taken, their eyes never leaving Aurelian's reflection in the mirror. They watched him with the tenderness of someone observing something dear to them, as if every minute by his side was too precious to waste, even for an instant. When the session ended, they left wearing their new robes, folded into enchanted bags that floated quietly behind them. The sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows on the stone facades of the alley. "I suppose, it's time to say goodbye," said Aurelian, stopping at the mouth of the alley. Hestia and Flora stood still. Hestia spoke. "We don't like to part with you, Aurelian. But we know we'll see you again soon," added Flora, with a small smile. Aurelian bowed his head, with a calm gesture. "We'll be at Hogwarts soon. We're always close there," he said, looking at them both with a warm gaze. Hestia and Flora looked at each other for a moment, as if talking to each other without words. Then, without warning, they approached Aurelian at the same time and wrapped him in a hug, as if they wanted to melt into him. It was not just any gesture. It was intimate, profound. They did not squeeze him tightly, but with intensity, with need. Their bodies trembled, as if that contact were the only thing that kept them whole. Aurelian stood still, surprised by the spontaneity of the gesture. But inside, something warm ignited, a spark amid his usual composure. Aurelian gently placed a hand on each of their heads. "We'll see each other sooner than you think. I promise." They slowly pulled away, as if it were difficult for them to let go. Then, without saying another word, the twins turned and walked away into the crowd, enveloped in that mysterious aura that always surrounded them. But before disappearing completely, they turned to look at him one last time. They were smiling. Aurelian stood silently, staring at the spot where he had last seen them. It wasn't sadness he felt, nor even melancholy. He sighed softly, standing in the same spot for a few seconds. Chapter 30 Chapter 30 Return to the Castle. King's Cross Station buzzed with the hustle and bustle of people, cats meowing, and parents saying goodbye with tears or tense smiles. Platform 9/3 appeared and disappeared before Muggle eyes like an impossible mirage. Aurelian walked steadily forward, accompanied by the invisible presence of Stinky, who walked a few steps behind him under a concealment spell. The elf, as always, made sure everything was in order before letting him go. When they were close enough to the enchanted platform, Stinky stopped, gave him a discreet bow, and disappeared into the shadows with a soft pop. Aurelian was dressed in simple clothes. His black robe was wrinkle-free, the gaunt crest discreetly embroidered on the chest. His face did not reflect the excitement that other children his age would show upon returning to Hogwarts. As soon as he crossed the threshold of the platform, he saw them. Hestia and Flora Caro. The twins turned as if they had sensed his arrival. Both wore dark, elegant robes adorned with small silver brooches that sparkled in the sunlight. Their hair was neatly styled, almost as if they had prepared themselves just for him. "Aurelian!" they exclaimed in unison, running toward him without caring that the curious eyes of other students were turned toward them. They didn't give him time to react. Hestia hugged him on his right side, while Flora hugged him on his left, as if the time without seeing him had been an unbearable sentence. "We missed you," whispered Flora, without moving an inch. "Too much," added Hestia in a soft tone. Aurelian just raised his head and said with a smile, "I'm here now. I told you we'd see each other sooner than you think." The Caros finally separated. They surrounded him as if he were a priceless treasure, their eyes scanning anyone who passed by. When Cedric Diggory and the Weasley twins appeared in the crowd, their posture softened, but their eyes remained alert. "Aurelian!" Fred shouted, raising his hand. "Merlin, how you've grown!" George joked, patting him on the shoulder. Cedric smiled warmly at the sight of them together, walked straight up to Aurelian, and gave him a heartfelt handshake. "I thought you'd be here earlier. Did you have trouble with your luggage?" "None at all," replied Aurelian. "I just took my time." "As always," muttered Cedric with a knowing smile. The doors of the Hogwarts Express opened with a hiss. Chaos briefly ensued as dozens of students rushed to secure their compartments. But Aurelian looked at the train calmly. "Shall we share a compartment?" asked George. "Of course," replied Aurelian, then turned his gaze to the Caros. "You're coming, right?" "Always," they said at the same time. They boarded the train without rushing. When they found an empty compartment near the end of the train, Aurelian sat by the window as usual. Flora settled in on his left and Hestia on his right. Cedric took the seat opposite him, while Fred and George slumped down, already planning some prank for the first day. "Ready for a new year?" Cedric asked. Aurelian nodded. He looked out the window as the platform began to slowly move away. "This year will be interesting," he finally said, in a low voice. The twins looked at him intently. Cedric frowned slightly, amused by his words. Fred and George exchanged curious glances, already accustomed to the answers Aurelian sometimes gave. The Hogwarts Express slowed down among the dark woods that preceded the castle. The sound of steam, metallic squeaks, and the creaking of wheels on the rails mingled with the students' growing anxiety for a new year. Aurelian gently closed a notebook. He had spent most of the trip reviewing his notes. He looked up just as the train began to slow down. His companions in the compartment began to stretch their arms and get ready to get off. The Hogsmeade platform was bathed in the dim light of dusk. A damp, cold air descended from the nearby mountains. The prefects began to organize the first years, while the older students headed familiarly toward the carriages waiting at the edge of the forest. Aurelian stopped. He saw them. No. They weren't horses. They were bony creatures with black skin stretched tight like parchment, membranous wings tucked at their sides, and white eyes that did not see but seemed to pierce the soul. Thestrals. Their mere presence broke the veil of the ordinary. Some students passed by them without noticing anything. "What's going on?" asked Cedric, already with one foot in the carriage stirrup. Aurelian did not answer immediately. He took a step forward. One of the creatures turned its head slightly toward him. The death of the Wanderer, he thought. The gaunt cottage. The black ring. The look on the man's face as he collapsed on the floor, writhing, life slipping from his eyes with an unfinished plea. He could see the Thestrals. "Aurelian, are you okay?" Flora asked quietly, now at his side, noticing his silence. "I can see them," he said without looking at her. "They're beautiful, in a way." Hestia tilted her head. "See what?" she said softly. Aurelian turned around. He saw in their eyes that they didn't understand. The creatures were invisible to them. To Cedric. To Fred and George. Only he could see them clearly. One of them took a step closer. It made no sound, but its breath was visible in the evening mist. Aurelian raised a hand and the creature bowed its head slightly, as if accepting his greeting. Its skin was cold to the touch. Not unpleasant. Cold as stone. "What are you touching?" George asked, puzzled. "Something not everyone can see," he replied calmly. He climbed into the carriage with the others, without explaining anything. The twins followed him without asking any more questions. Cedric closed the door. The vehicle started moving on its own, as far as most could see. But Aurelian knew what was pulling them. During the journey, as the carriage made its way along the road to the castle, Aurelian remained silent. The vision of the Thestrals lingered in his mind. As a reminder, he had already crossed an invisible line. He had already witnessed death. One that he himself had caused. The world of the living and the world of the dead were not so different. They were separated by only a glance. When Hogwarts Castle appeared in the distance, he knew that his second year would be the beginning of something deeper. The great hall glowed with its usual majesty, floating candles creating an artificial sky, suspended above the long tables where students chatted and laughed. The stone walls seemed to pulsate with magic, and the Hogwarts crest shone brightly above the teacher's table. The new students, trembling, were led to the front by Professor McGonagall, her young, elegant figure and steady gaze commanding respect. The selection with the sorting hat had begun. Names, new faces, applause in each house. Aurelian watched them without emotion, mentally noting those he remembered from his past life. Next to him, Hestia and Flora whispered to each other, glancing at him out of the corner of their eyes, as if waiting for his approval of each new student selected for Slytherin. Cedric, from the Hufflepuff table, smiled at him from a distance, and the twins made an exaggerated gesture from the Gryffindor table that Aurelian did not return. Finally, when the last student was assigned and the applause died down, all eyes turned to the center of the main table. Albus Dumbledore. His eyes rose and effortlessly dominated the entire hall. The magic around him was palpable, like a gravitational field of its own. When he spoke, he did so without raising his voice too much, yet every word echoed off the enchanted walls. "Welcome, once again, to Hogwarts." The silence was absolute. To the older students, "I am glad to see you return." To the new ones, "Know that you have crossed a threshold more important than you can imagine. This castle is a refuge, yes, but also a mirror. Here you will see your fears, your talents, your decisions reflected." Aurelian listened attentively. Dumbledore's voice had a particular air about it, as if each word had a hidden weight, a double meaning. "The magical world," he continued, "is not static. It is changing, and you will be the ones to change it, whether you want to or not. The knowledge you acquire here can protect, heal, or destroy." A slight murmur ran through the room. "Within these walls, you will learn more than spells. You will learn limits and, with luck, to surpass yourselves." Dumbledore's gaze swept across the tables. It lingered for a barely perceptible second on Aurelian. A spark, almost imperceptible, crossed the air. Then he continued, "This year, some changes will take place. There will be a review of the approach to teaching ancient runes. We have begun to register unusual signs at the boundaries of the Forbidden Forest, so security will be reinforced." Some students grew restless. Others looked at each other in confusion. "But tonight, you should only think about one thing, dinner." With a subtle wave of his wand, the plates filled with food. Beef stew, pumpkin pie, juices, warm bread, enchanted puddings that levitated before falling onto empty plates. The great hall erupted in cheers. Dumbledore remained standing, watching the students with an indecipherable expression. The twins began to serve themselves calmly, even closer to him than the previous year. Flora offered him a glass of pumpkin juice without saying a word. Hestia placed a little cake on his plate as if it were the most normal thing in the world. He took what they offered him without saying anything, already beginning to wonder, what were those unusual signs near the Forbidden Forest? An accident? A test? As the students enjoyed their dinner and the sound of cutlery and conversation mingled in the enchanted air of the Great Hall, Dumbledore raised his hand again. Silence fell almost immediately. "Before you indulge yourselves completely in dessert," he said with a slight smile, "I would like to make one last announcement." The candles flickered slightly, as if paying attention. "Some of you may have noticed that our dear Professor Lucanroll is not with us tonight." Some students murmured, but Aurelian already knew this would happen. Professor Roll has been called away on personal business that prevents him from continuing in his position at Hogwarts this year. "We will not go into details," he added, downplaying the matter. Dumbledore paused, gauging the reactions. "In his place, we are pleased to welcome someone whose experience in real combat and defensive magic is beyond question. A former Auror from the Ministry of Magic, retired years ago after an extensive and decorated career. A witch who has faced the worst of dark magic, and come out standing." Everyone's eyes turned to the end of the teacher's table, where a middle-aged woman slowly rose to her feet. Dark hair, somewhat short, with grey strands at the temples, her bearing was straight, firm. Her face had a discreet scar on her left cheek, and her eyes were a pale grey that did not blink easily. She wore an unadorned robe, but with a subtle embroidered insignia of the Aura office on the collar. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Dumbledore, "Professor Callista Blake." She nodded briefly, without saying a word. Aurelian watched her closely. There was something about her posture that spoke of discipline, but also of wounds. She was the kind of person who didn't read defense books, she had lived them. Interesting, he thought. A former combatant. She won't teach like role. But she's certainly better than the future teachers. Fred muttered something to George. Cedric tensed slightly. The Caro twins, on the other hand, kept their eyes fixed on Aurelian, not caring in the least what was happening around them. Dumbledore resumed speaking. "Professor Blake will share with you not only theory, but real cases, unusual spells, and experiences that could save your lives. A warning disguised as praise. Now," he added, "enjoy your dessert." The plates were refilled with cakes, mountains of cream, enchanted fruits, and pastries that exploded with sparkles. New chapter is coming soon. Write a review.